Imagine this. You're a human about 10,000 years ago. You've got messy hair, you smell like smoke and mammoth stew, and life is mostly about not starving. But then one day you realize you have more goats than you did yesterday. Or maybe fewer, you're not sure. You try counting them on your fingers, but you run out of fingers before you run out of goats. This is the moment when humanity realizes we need a system. We need math. Now, early counting wasn't math in the way we know it today. It wasn't equations, it wasn't formulas, and it definitely wasn't calculus. It was survival. It was making sure your neighbor didn't quietly borrow 3 cows and forget to return them. Numbers were born out of suspicion. Math started as a way to keep people honest. The first accountants weren't sitting in offices wearing ties. They were standing in muddy fields, staring at sheep. Imagine a guy with messy hair, muttering to himself, holding a bunch of rocks, each rock meaning one sheep. That's the very first balance sheet. Not glamorous, but extremely practical. Honestly, the first accountant was basically a guy really obsessed with sheep and goats, and making sure his neighbor Dave wasn't scamming him. Now, rocks were one thing, but humanity quickly invented tokens, small clay pieces, each one shaped differently to represent different things. A cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, a cylinder for a sheep. Each token was a little promise, a symbol that said, "Yes, I definitely have this many sheep at home. Please trust me." It was math turned into objects. These tokens date back to Mesopotamia, around 8000 BC. Think of them as the earliest version of your pocket calculator, except made of clay and way less convenient. Imagine carrying around 200 tiny clay cones in your pocket. You'd jingle like a medieval keychain, and if you tripped, your entire net worth would scatter across the floor. Not exactly user-friendly, but still, this was progress. Eventually, people realized they could press these tokens into soft clay tablets and then seal the tokens inside. That way you didn't lose them. What you had was basically a contract, a clay envelope with math baked right into it. Later, they ditched the physical tokens altogether and just drew the impressions directly into the clay. Boom, the world's first written numbers, and also the world's first receipts. The origin story of every painful moment you've ever had at the checkout line. This wasn't just a quirky idea. It transformed society. If you can record who owes what, suddenly you can build trust beyond your immediate family or tribe. Before, trust was personal. I know you, I know your face. And if you scam me, I can chase you with a stick. But when cities grew bigger, you couldn't know everyone. You needed something stronger than memory. Numbers became trust. Math became the glue holding civilization together. And with that came trade. Imagine two villages. One has cows, the other has grain. Without numbers, trade is basically, I'll give you some cows for some grain, which leads to endless debates like, but my cow is very fluffy. That's worth at least double grain. With numbers, you can say, okay, 1 cow equals 10 baskets of grain. It standardizes things. No more arguing about cow fluffiness. But trade also meant disputes. People cheated. That's when measurements entered the game. You'd have weights carved out of stone, carefully measured, to make sure that a pound of grain was actually a pound of grain. Imagine ancient inspectors standing around like, "Excuse me, sir, but that looks like 9 baskets, not 10. We've all agreed on the rules. Don't mess this up." The roots of math were social. They were about fairness. One of the fascinating things is that the first number systems were not abstract. They weren't invented by philosophers who loved thinking. They were invented by merchants who loved not being robbed. Numbers were literally shaped by cows and grain. The word calculate itself comes from calculus, meaning small stones, because people literally used stones to count things. So the next time someone says math is abstract, remember that it started with a guy counting rocks in a field. Of course, humans being humans, we didn't stop there. The counting systems evolved. The Sumerians, those geniuses of Mesopotamia, used a base 60 system. Why 60? Because it divides nicely into so many fractions. You can split it into halves, thirds, quarters, fifths. That's why today we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. When you're looking at a clock, you're staring at the mathematical ghost of ancient sheep counters, which is both beautiful and a little funny. Let's pause here and appreciate how revolutionary this was. Imagine living in a world with no numbers. Then suddenly you can count, record, compare, and standardize. That's not just progress, that's magic. It's like someone inventing Wi-Fi in the Stone Age. And all because one day someone didn't trust their neighbor about a goat. This early math wasn't about beauty or elegance. It wasn't about proving theorems. It was math as a survival tool, and it worked. It gave rise to cities. It allowed long-distance trade. It created the first bureaucracies, and yes, it made paperwork a thing, which means you can blame Mesopotamia for every form you've ever had to fill out. But think about the scale of change. With clay tokens, you could run an economy bigger than a single village. You could manage taxes, store surpluses, and organize armies. Civilization itself is impossible without accounting, which is a wild thought. We didn't build math because we loved it. We built math because cows are hard to keep track of. Now, here's a fun image. Picture two Sumerian merchants. One is trying to sell 10 sheep. The other is suspicious. Are you sure you have 10 sheep? Yes, here are 10 clay tokens. All right, but last week you said that was only 8 sheep. Well, those were smaller sheep. Math begins as a comedy of mistrust. But from that comedy came the ability to build empires. When you really think about it, math didn't just count things, it made things real. A cow is just a cow, but once you can assign a number to it, that cow becomes part of a system. It can be compared, exchanged, taxed, recorded. It becomes wealth. Without numbers, wealth is just animals wandering around a field. With numbers, wealth becomes something you can carry in your pocket, or scratch into clay. Wealth becomes portable, abstract, transferable. Wealth becomes money. And so, in muddy Mesopotamian fields, with cows mooing and merchants bickering, math quietly transformed from a few rocks in a hand into the foundation of civilization. Counting cows gave us numbers. Numbers gave us trust. And trust gave us trade. This is where money begins, not with gold or coins, but with math carved into clay. It all started with a guy counting sheep, and really not wanting to be cheated. If Chapter 1 was all about counting cows and carrying rocks, Chapter 2 is about the moment humanity got tired of juggling pebbles and decided to write things down. And honestly, this is where things get hilariously bureaucratic, because while everyone remembers Mesopotamia for inventing the wheel, writing and beer, what they really did was invent the world's first spreadsheets. And yes, they were made of clay. So, let's set the scene. We're in ancient Sumer, somewhere around 3000 BC. The city is buzzing with trade. Merchants are bringing in grain, livestock, textiles, and somebody somewhere is trying to keep track of all of this. Tokens were fine for a while, but then came the clay tablet. Imagine a dull grey rectangle, about the size of an iPad, except much heavier, totally unresponsive to touch, and guaranteed to break your foot if you dropped it. This was their version of Excel. What did they do with these clay tablets? They pressed little marks into the clay, using a reed stylus. Each symbol stood for a number, a product, or a person, and just like that, you had a permanent record, permanent as in still existing thousands of years later, which is how we know what the Sumerians were up to. Spoiler, mostly grain management. Lots and lots of grain. Here's the amazing thing. These tablets are the reason we know about early math at all. Some of them are essentially inventory lists. 20 sheep delivered, 40 jars of beer owed, 2 slaves missing. Yes, they wrote that down. And yes, somewhere in history there's a very annoyed Sumerian accountant recording. We are still missing those two slaves. If found, please return immediately. Bureaucracy has always been both deadly serious and unintentionally hilarious. But these clay tablets weren't just lists, they were trust machines. Imagine you're a temple priest in charge of storing grain for the community. People come in, they deposit grain, they expect to get it back later. Without records, this is chaos. But with tablets, you can point and say, look, Uber the farmer deposited 30 baskets of barley. It's right here in clay. If he comes back, we give him 30 back. No arguments. Clay tablets created accountability. They made numbers official. And here's the thing, this wasn't just record keeping, it was a social revolution. Writing itself grew out of this need to record numbers. We think of writing as being about literature, poetry, storytelling. Nope. The earliest writing was about taxes, which is either the most disappointing or the most realistic origin story ever. Humanity didn't invent writing to create epic tales. We invented it to make sure no one was stealing too much wheat. Now, let's talk about who was running this system. It wasn't ordinary farmers, it was the temples. Temples were the banks of Mesopotamia. They stored grain, lent it out, and kept records. Priests weren't just religious figures, they were financial administrators, which is both funny and logical. Who else could you trust with your grain? The gods, after all, were watching, or at least their priests were, scribbling away on clay tablets. In a sense, the world's first bankers wore robes and burned incense. So picture this. Inside a grand Sumerian temple, rows of clay tablets stacked on shelves, each tablet carefully labeled. A dusty archive of transactions, promises, debts. The original data center. The first server farm. Only instead of humming machines, you've got sweating scribes. And instead of air conditioning, you've got goats wandering outside. But the principle is the same. Information stored, organized, retrievable. Math became physical memory. And let's be honest, these scribes were basically the original IT guys. They were the ones making sure data didn't get lost. They baked the clay tablets in ovens to make them permanent. No risk of accidentally deleting a file here. Well, unless you literally dropped the tablet and it shattered, which, to be fair, was probably the Mesopotamian version of blue screen of death. But why does this matter? Because once you can record debts, credits, inventories, you can create complex systems. You can have long-distance trade. You can plan for the future. You can lend grain and demand interest. Clay tablets turned abstract math into social power. Whoever controlled the tablets controlled the city. The scribes weren't just writing, they were shaping the economy. Here's a little anecdote. Archaeologists have found tablets that detail beer rations for workers. Yes, beer. Workers were literally paid in daily portions of beer. The tablets carefully note how much each worker got, which means that the world's first HR department wasn't tracking vacation days. They were tracking how many pints of beer you'd earned digging ditches. If that's not motivation, I don't know what is. And this brings us back to the humor of the whole thing. Imagine being that scribe, sitting there all day carving into clay. Worker A gets 2 pints. Worker B gets 3 pints. Worker B gets 3 pints. Worker B still owes us 1 pint from last week. The world's first Excel spreadsheet is a bar tab. Civilization runs on beer math. It makes you wonder what future archaeologists will think when they dig up our spreadsheets. Wow, these people were obsessed with quarterly sales targets. And apparently cats, because here's an entire folder called Funny Cat Memes. But let's zoom out. The deeper idea is that math, in this form, equals trust. Numbers recorded in clay were more than numbers. They were agreements. If it's in clay, it's official. And this created a new kind of society. One where people could trade with strangers because the records backed them up. You didn't need to know someone personally to trust them. You just needed to trust the math. And that's a big leap for humanity. This system had consequences. It allowed cities to grow, economies to expand, and empires to form. But it also made math something ordinary people had to engage with. You couldn't escape it. If you wanted to work, pay taxes, or trade, math was baked, literally baked into your life. Imagine your landlord showing up with a clay tablet saying, "See, it says right here you owe 3 jars of oil. Pay up." It's bureaucracy in its earliest clay-covered form. And maybe that's why these tablets feel so familiar. They're not ancient curiosities, they're the ancestors of every receipt, every invoice, every spreadsheet we deal with today. Whenever you complain about paperwork, just remember people have been complaining about paperwork for 5,000 years. The only difference is that now when we mess up, we blame Microsoft Excel. Back then, they blamed the scribe and maybe the gods. So, let's wrap up this chapter. From tokens in chapter 1, we've now moved to tablets. From carrying little clay cones in your pocket, to writing entire inventories in wet clay. From trust between neighbors, to trust backed by official records. This was a revolution. The first big leap in the history of money and math. And it happened not because humans loved numbers, but because humans loved keeping track of beer, goats, and grain. And so, the clay tablet wasn't just an object. It was a promise that math could capture reality, store it, and protect it from forgetfulness and fraud. The world's first spreadsheets weren't digital. They were dusty, and yet they worked. They built trust. They built trade. They built civilization. All from the simple act of pressing numbers into mud. So far, we've been talking about math as a way to count cows and write beer rations into clay. Practical, necessary, but still kind of clunky. But in this chapter, things get spicy, because this is where math takes the next leap. It doesn't just count stuff, it becomes the stuff. This is when numbers stop being about objects and start being about value itself. This is the birth of money as an abstract idea, and it's way stranger than you'd think. Let's rewind. In the beginning, everything was barter. You have grain, I have goats. Let's make a deal. Sounds simple, but here's the problem with barter. It's a nightmare. Imagine you're a goat herder who wants shoes. You show up at the sandal maker's shop with a goat. The sandal maker says, "Sorry, I don't need a goat. I need grain." Now you've got a problem. You have to find someone with grain who also wants a goat, then convince them to trade, then carry the grain to the sandal maker. It's like the world's most exhausting puzzle game. This is called the double coincidence of wants. Both people in a trade have to want exactly what the other person has, at the same time, in the same place. Barter works fine in tiny villages, but once communities get bigger, it falls apart. Too many people, too many needs, too much hassle. Humanity needed a hack, and math gave us one. The hack was standardization. Instead of trading random goats and baskets, why not agree on a common unit of value, something that everyone accepts, no matter what? That's the birth of money. And here's the weird thing. Money is basically math you can hold. It's an abstraction. A symbol that says, this object equals this much value. And once you accept that, suddenly trade gets way easier. But before coins, before paper, before Bitcoin, money often started as stuff with agreed value. Shells, beads, salt. Yes, salt. That's why the word salary comes from salarium, the Roman word for salt money. Imagine being paid in seasoning. Hey honey, I got my paycheck. It's 4 bags of salt. Let's go wild tonight and put extra on the fish. For thousands of years, money wasn't gold. It was groceries. Now, how did math sneak into this? Through weights and measures. If salt is money, you need to know how much salt. If silver is money, you need scales to weigh it. Suddenly, every trade depends on precision. Too much or too little. and someone feels cheated, which is why ancient governments started regulating weights. They made standard measures. Everyone agreed this chunk of metal weighs exactly 1 shekel. This jar holds exactly 1 mina of grain. It wasn't about fairness in the abstract. It was about math as law. A great example comes from Mesopotamia again. They used silver by weight. Not coins, just lumps of silver. And if you wanted to buy something, you'd pull out your silver, put it on the scale, and balance it against standardized weights. The math was right there in the marketplace. Trade wasn't just social negotiation, it was arithmetic in public. Picture ancient merchants hunched over scales, frowning like, "Excuse me, sir, that silver lump is looking a little light." Basically, the first customer service disputes. And it wasn't just Mesopotamia. Ancient Egypt had its own system. They loved fractions, and they used them to measure grain and bread. A third of a loaf, a quarter of a loaf, all carefully notated. Imagine standing at a bakery in 2000 BC and saying, "Yes, I'd like 5/12 of that round loaf, please." Egyptian trade math was deliciously complicated, but it made commerce predictable. Here's where it gets fun. Once you have standardized weights and measures, you can assign value to almost anything. A cow can equal 10 shekels of silver. A basket of dates can equal 1 shekel. Suddenly, goods become numbers, and those numbers can be compared, exchanged, stored. That's when money stops being just stuff and starts being math, because it's no longer about the object itself. It's about the value it represents. A shekel isn't just silver, it's a unit in an equation that balances economies. Let me tell you about one of my favorite anecdotes. Ancient Babylonian loan contracts. Archaeologists have found tablets showing loans written out in cuneiform, complete with interest rates. Someone borrows grain, promises to repay with extra grain later, and it's all recorded. This is math in action, numbers as promises, but also math as pressure, because once you write it down, you can't weasel out of it. Debt collectors existed thousands of years ago, and they carried clay tablets. That's scarier than any modern credit card statement. This abstraction of value is huge. It lets economies scale. Without it, you're stuck swapping goats and sandals forever. With it, you can have taxes, wages, markets, savings, and yes, scams too. Because the moment you standardize, somebody figures out how to cheat the system. Lighter weights, fake silver, sneaky contracts. Humans have always been creative, especially about money. But here's the philosophical kicker. Money isn't real. It's a story we all agree on, a shared hallucination backed by math. That's why a piece of silver or a clay token or a digital Bitcoin can function as money. Not because of what it is, but because of the math and trust behind it. Money is math turned into belief, which is kind of beautiful and kind of terrifying. Think about it. When you log into your bank account, the numbers you see aren't piles of cash sitting somewhere. They're just digital records, a modern version of clay tablets. If everyone stopped believing in the system tomorrow, those numbers would mean nothing. But as long as we agree, math holds the illusion together. Civilization runs on numbers, not coins. And this is why we say math became money. Because once math was used to measure, record, and standardize, the numbers stopped being about cows or grain. They started being about value itself. You could exchange numbers for anything. Numbers became portable wealth. That's money. So let's wrap this up. In this chapter, we saw the shift from barter, messy, awkward, goat-filled, to standardized trade backed by math. We saw how weights and measures turned stuff into numbers, how promises written on clay became the first debts, how silver, salt, and bread were transformed into abstract value, and how money isn't just stuff, it's a mathematical story we all believe. In other words, money is math in costume, and the costume keeps changing. Salt, silver, gold, paper, digital code. But underneath, it's always the same, numbers holding civilization together. By now, math has already stopped being just rocks in a field. We've moved from counting sheep to scribbling numbers in clay to inventing money as an abstraction. But humans being humans, we weren't satisfied. We wanted shortcuts, hacks, and something shiny to carry around instead of clay receipts and heavy bags of silver. This is where fractions, coins, and some really clever math tricks come into play. Or, as I like to call it, the moment humanity upgraded its financial software from clay beta version to metal edition. Let's start with fractions. Fractions are like the underdog of math. Nobody loves them. Kids hate learning them, adults secretly hate using them, and even mathematicians groan about them. But for ancient people, fractions were the MVP of trade, because nothing ruins a good deal faster than realizing you can't split a loaf of bread evenly between three people. Fractions were the grease in the gears of commerce. Take Egypt, for example. The Egyptians loved fractions, but they did them in a very peculiar way. They used what are called unit fractions. That means every fraction had to have a 1 on top. Instead of saying 2/3, they would write 1/2 plus 1/6. Instead of 3/4, they'd write 1/2 plus 1/4. Why? Because apparently ancient Egyptian scribes wanted to make math as inconvenient as possible. Or maybe they just liked to show off. Either way, their system was messy, but it worked. It allowed them to measure grain, divide bread, and calculate wages. Imagine being at a bakery in Thebes. Yes, I'd like 1/2 plus 1/4 of a loaf, please. Sounds weird, but that's how business ran. Fractions weren't just for bread. They were for taxes, trade, and construction too. Want to build a pyramid? You better know how to divide stones into precise ratios. And yet, the Egyptians did it without calculators, without decimals, without the number 0. Honestly, it's mind-blowing. Their entire fraction system was one big hack, a workaround for not having easier notation, and it still worked well enough to build some of the most impressive monuments on Earth. Fractions annoying, but powerful. Now let's talk about coins. Coins were a game changer. Picture the scene before coins. You're dragging around sacks of grain, chunks of silver, jars of oil. Not exactly convenient for a quick trip to the market. Then along comes the coin, small, portable, stamped with an official seal. Suddenly, wealth fits in your pocket. Civilization collectively went, "Oh, thank the gods, finally." The first true coins were minted in Lydia, a kingdom in what's now Turkey, around 600 BC. They were made of electrum, a naturally occurring mix of gold and silver. And here's the genius part. They were stamped with an official design. That stamp was basically a math certificate. It said, "This coin weighs exactly this much. It's worth exactly this amount. No scales required." That stamp turned shiny metal into standardized money. And the Lydians, they were onto something. Coins spread like wildfire. The Greeks loved them, the Persians loved them, the Romans really loved them. Every empire stamped their leaders' faces onto coins, partly to prove authenticity, and partly because rulers have always had a thing for seeing their own portraits everywhere. Coins were propaganda, and math rolled into one. You weren't just buying bread, you were staring at the emperor's nose while doing it. The math hack here is obvious. Coins replaced endless weighing and measuring with instant value recognition. No more fiddling with scales in the marketplace. No more clay tablets listing debts in shekels of silver dust. Just coins ready to spend. Imagine the relief. It's like switching from dial-up internet to Wi-Fi. The same service, but suddenly much faster and easier. But of course, coins introduced new problems. If money is just stamped metal, what stops someone from making fake coins? Counterfeiting was a huge issue in the ancient world. People shaved the edges off coins, melted down lower quality metals, and tried to pass them off as the real deal. Entire economies were threatened by fakes, which meant governments had to invent anti-counterfeiting math tricks, specific weights, detailed engravings, secret alloy recipes. The war between real and fake money is as old as coins themselves. Today we call it cybersecurity. Back then, it was just keeping an eye on your coins and hoping your emperor wasn't cheaping out on the metal. And here's a fun image for you. Ancient coins weren't all perfect circles. Some were lumpy, irregular, even kind of ugly. Imagine buying a loaf of bread with a coin that looks like someone sat on it. Coins were practical, not pretty. The idea of perfectly round, shiny coins is a much later thing. Early on, it was just, does it weigh the right amount, yes or no? Practicality beat aesthetics. Now let's circle back to the humor. If coins were standardized chunks of math, they were also dangerous chunks of math. Why? Because you could accidentally swallow them. Think about it. Small, round, shiny. Historians don't talk about this, but I guarantee someone in antiquity choked on a coin while trying to show off at a tavern. Coins were basically ancient pocket calculators you could accidentally swallow. Useful but risky. The beauty of coins is that they made math invisible. You no longer had to calculate every time you bought something. The coin was the calculation. Its weight, its stamp, its design. All the math was baked into the object, which is why coins spread everywhere. They were math you could spend without even thinking about it. But coins didn't replace fractions. The two worked together. Fractions divided loaves, coins standardized trade, and together they smoothed out the messy edges of barter. Fractions solved the problem of how do we split this thing fairly, and coins solved the problem of how do we agree on value quickly. Commerce became faster, easier, bigger. So let's step back. This chapter shows how humanity layered hacks on hacks. Fractions were a hack for dividing goods without decimals. Coins were a hack for carrying value without scales. Both made life easier, both made economies grow, and both pushed math deeper into daily life. You didn't have to be a scribe or a priest anymore. If you bought bread, paid wages, or counted taxes, you were using math hacks every day. And here's the real kicker. These hacks still shape us. We still use fractions. We still use coins. Okay, maybe less coins now, but the idea lives on in our pocket change and digital wallets. Every time you pull out a quarter or split a pizza into eighths, you're doing math that goes back thousands of years. Math is like that. It's sticky. Once invented, it never really leaves. It just hides inside new systems. So next time you complain about fractions in school, remember without them, you'd never get your fair share of bread. And next time you see a coin, remember you're holding a piece of standardized math, an ancient hack that made trade possible. Math didn't just build money, it was the money. And sometimes it was money you could accidentally choke on. If you want to know how much math can shape an empire, just look at Rome. The Romans weren't just good at building roads, aqueducts, and very dramatic gladiator shows. They were also world-class experts in the one thing nobody likes to talk about: taxes. Rome didn't just collect taxes, it industrialized them, and the entire empire ran on a giant mathematical machine of censuses, ledgers, and calculations. Without math, Rome wouldn't have been Rome. It would have just been a bunch of guys in sandals arguing in Latin. So let's start with the census. Every 5 years, Roman officials went around and counted the people. Not just people, but their property too. Land, slaves, livestock, even furniture sometimes. Everything got tallied. And the reason wasn't curiosity. It was money. The census was a giant spreadsheet for taxation and military service. You weren't just a citizen, you were a number in Rome's accounting system. The empire saw you less as Marcus the baker, and more as Marcus owes 3 denarii in taxes, eligible to serve in the legions. Bureaucracy at its finest. Now this sounds boring, but imagine the logistics. The Roman Empire stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Millions of people, and officials had to count them all, record the numbers, and make sure taxes were collected. That's not just administration. That's an early form of big data. Rome didn't have Excel, but it had an army of scribes with wax tablets and sharp styluses. Honestly, the Roman tax system was scarier than their actual army. A soldier might take your land. A tax collector would take it legally. And let's talk about the taxes themselves. Romans taxed almost everything: land, property, sales, inheritances, even urine. Yes, urine. Emperor Vespasian imposed a tax on public urinals because the waste was collected and used in tanning leather. People complained, of course, and Vespasian shrugged and said, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. That phrase has been repeated for 2,000 years, and it all started because Rome literally taxed pee. Math was so powerful it could turn bodily fluids into revenue. But to pull this off, you needed a number system. And here's where Rome really struggled. Because Roman numerals are, let's be honest, terrible. Sure, they look classy on a clock face or at the end of a Super Bowl, but try adding with them, or worse, multiplying. It's a nightmare. Let's say you want to multiply x fourth by 13. That's 24 times 13. Easy for us. But for Romans, it was like doing algebra with a hangover. X fourth quet 13 looks less like math and more like a secret code in a bad spy novel. And yet, Rome ran a vast economy using this clunky system. Tax collectors had to add up tributes, subtract expenses, calculate military pay, all in numerals that didn't even have a zero. Imagine doing your taxes without a zero. You can't use place value. You can't line numbers up neatly. Everything is a mess of letters, and still the empire functioned, which honestly makes Roman administrators some of the most underappreciated math heroes in history. Speaking of military pay, that's another math-heavy part of Rome. Soldiers were promised regular wages, bonuses and land when they retired. This required careful calculation. Pay too little, and your soldiers revolt. Pay too much, and you bankrupt the empire. Some emperors actually did go bankrupt trying to keep the legions happy. You could say the empire was as much balanced on ledgers as it was on swords. The math of payroll was as important as the strategy of war. And let's not forget infrastructure. Those famous Roman roads and aqueducts, funded by taxes. Every stone block was basically bought with math. The more the empire expanded, the more taxes it needed. Conquered provinces were squeezed for tribute, all calculated and recorded. To be conquered by Rome wasn't just to face their armies, it was to face their accountants. You didn't just lose a battle, you gained a tax bill. Here's a fun story. In the New Testament, there's that famous line about Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem for the census. That's not just religious detail. That's Roman bureaucracy in action. Everyone had to go register, so the empire knew how much to tax them, which means one of the most famous journeys in history happened because Rome loved paperwork. Talk about math shaping destiny. Now, the tax system wasn't just about money. It was about control. Numbers gave Rome power. If they knew how many people lived in a province, how much land they owned, how much grain they produced, they could govern it more effectively. Knowledge was power, and math was knowledge. The census wasn't just data collection, it was domination by numbers. But of course, people hated paying taxes. Some tried to avoid them. And Rome responded with even more math. Detailed audits, fines, penalties. If you think modern tax audits are scary, imagine a Roman tax collector showing up at your door with soldiers, demanding proof that your olive harvest really was as small as you claimed. The math of taxation was enforced with spears. And yet, despite the inefficiency of Roman numerals, the system worked for centuries. The empire collected enough money to build massive monuments, fund enormous armies, and keep the machine running. It wasn't perfect. Corruption was rampant, and emperors often manipulated the system. But it was effective enough to sustain one of the largest empires in history. Let's step back and appreciate the irony. Rome gave us aqueducts, law, architecture, and military strategy. But their math, kind of clumsy. They built an empire on a number system that today we wouldn't even let near a high school algebra class. And still, it worked. Which makes you wonder how much more efficient could they have been if they'd invented zero earlier or adopted Hindu-Arabic numerals. Maybe the empire wouldn't have fallen. Maybe Rome collapsed not because of barbarians, but because of math homework. So here's the takeaway. Rome turned math into power. It used numbers to count people, calculate taxes, pay armies, and control provinces. It turned urine into revenue and soldiers into spreadsheets. It built an empire on ledgers as much as on legions. Math wasn't just behind the scenes. It was the engine driving the whole machine. The Roman tax system was the software of the empire. And while the roads have crumbled and the aqueducts have dried, the idea of taxation through math is still with us today. Every time you file a tax return, you're participating in a tradition as old as Rome. Congratulations, you're basically a Roman citizen with Wi-Fi. If you thought Roman numerals were clunky, you're right. They were basically math cosplay, great for looking dramatic on monuments, terrible for actual calculations. But humanity eventually stumbled across one of the greatest inventions in history. Not the wheel, not sliced bread, not even pizza. I'm talking about zero. The most powerful idea in mathematics. The nothing that changed everything. And our story takes us to India, where zero was born. Now, let's be clear, the concept of nothing existed long before the number zero. People knew about empty baskets, empty fields, empty stomachs. Trust me, prehistoric humans were very familiar with hunger. But the leap from nothing to a symbol that represents nothing and can be used in math was gigantic. It's one thing to say, I have no goats. It's another to write down a symbol for 0 goats and then use that symbol to calculate. That leap took centuries. The magic wasn't just the number 0, it was the place value system that came with it. Here's the genius. In a place value system, the position of a digit matters. 10 is different from 1. 100 is different from 10. And to make that work, you need a placeholder. You need 0. Without it, you can't distinguish between 206 and 26. 0 is like the silent partner in math, the background character that makes the main characters shine. The idea developed in India around the 5th century CE. Indian mathematicians like Brahmagupta began using a dot to represent 0 in calculations. At first, it wasn't glamorous. It was just a practical fix. But soon they realized it opened doors to entirely new mathematics. Brahmagupta even laid down rules for how 0 behaves. 0 plus something equals the same thing. 0 minus something equals negative something, and so on. He was basically writing the instruction manual for nothingness. Let's pause to appreciate how weird that is. Most cultures struggle to even imagine nothing as a number. The Greeks hated the idea. To them, numbers were supposed to count things. You can count apples, goats, soldiers, but how do you count nothing? Aristotle himself argued that 0 wasn't a number. Meanwhile, India was like, we'll just give it a dot and move on. That one dot was worth more than all of Aristotle's philosophy when it came to building modern math. And here's where the humor comes in. 0 is the Beyoncé of math. Quiet for centuries, then suddenly everywhere. Once India had it, the idea spread. Through trade, it traveled to the Islamic world. Arabic mathematicians adopted it, refined it, and passed it on to Europe. By the time it reached the West, 0 was unstoppable. It was the missing puzzle piece that made everything easier. It's like humanity collectively downloaded a new math update. Suddenly, multiplication, division, and accounting became lightning fast compared to Roman numerals. Picture a medieval merchant trying to calculate profits. With Roman numerals, it's a painful slog of letters. With Hindu-Arabic numerals and 0, it's smooth and fast. Imagine switching from dial-up internet to fiber optic. That's the scale of the improvement. Zero wasn't just a symbol, it was turbo boost for civilization. And the economic consequences were massive. Banking, double-entry bookkeeping, long-distance trade, all of it exploded once zero arrived in Europe around the 12th century. Merchants could now keep detailed ledgers without going insane. Governments could track taxes more efficiently. Mathematicians could develop algebra and calculus. Without zero, modern finance doesn't exist. Honestly, without zero, most of the modern world doesn't exist. But let's zoom back to India for a moment. It's fascinating that this world-changing invention came from a culture obsessed with the infinite. Indian philosophy often dealt with cycles of creation and destruction, with the void, with nothingness as a concept. Maybe it's not a coincidence that zero emerged there, where other civilizations feared nothingness. India embraced it. That cultural comfort with the void may have made it easier to see nothing as a number, not a problem. Here's a little anecdote. When zero reached Europe, people were suspicious. Italian merchants in the 13th century started using zero in their books. Authorities didn't trust it. They thought zeros could be easily altered, turning a 10 into 100. Some cities even banned the use of Arabic numerals. Imagine being fined for writing zero instead of X. But progress is hard to stop. Zero was simply too useful. Merchants loved it. Bankers loved it. Mathematicians loved it. And eventually everyone gave in. Zero became king. The beauty of zero is also in its paradox. It's nothing, but it makes everything work. It has no value, but it gives value to numbers around it. Put a zero after a 1, and suddenly you've got 10. Add another, and you've got 100. Zero multiplies value by standing there doing nothing. That's some next-level life advice. Sometimes the most powerful move is to just exist. And think about money. Without zero, modern accounting collapses. Imagine trying to calculate compound interest without place value. Imagine writing bank balances in Roman numerals. You'd spend more time counting letters than earning money. Zero made commerce scalable. It made loans, taxes, and savings efficient. In a very real sense, zero built capitalism, which is kind of hilarious. An entire global system of wealth built on nothing. Even today, zero shows up everywhere in finance. Zeros on paychecks, zeros on debts, zeros in inflation. Add a zero, you're rich. Lose a zero, you're broke. Countries even brag about how many zeros are on their GDP. And when hyperinflation hits, zeros take over. Think of Zimbabwe printing trillion-dollar notes. That's zero on steroids. The symbol that once baffled philosophers now dictates economies. So, let's wrap this up. Zero wasn't just an invention. It was a revolution. It turned clumsy number systems into sleek engines of calculation. It made place value possible. It fueled the rise of banking, trade, and finance. It gave mathematicians the tools to invent new branches of knowledge. And it gave the modern world the ability to count, calculate, and create wealth on a massive scale. Zero is nothing, and yet it's everything. It's the invisible hero of math. The dot that changed the world. Without it, you wouldn't be watching this video. You wouldn't even have a smartphone. You'd just have a sack of goats and some very tired Roman numerals. So the next time you see a zero, don't dismiss it. Bow down to it. Because that little circle of nothingness is the reason our world adds up at all. We've now got zero, place value, and a number system that finally makes sense. The stage is set for something big. And sure enough, out of the deserts and cities of the Islamic Golden Age comes one of the most powerful tools ever created: algebra. It sounds scary, but trust me, algebra is less about tormenting school kids with X's and Y's, and more about solving real-world problems. And those problems were usually about, you guessed it, money. Algebra and banking grew up together, like two best friends who would later run the world. Let's start with the name. Algebra comes from the Arabic word algebra, which means reunion of broken parts or restoration. The word first appears in the title of a book written around 820 CE by a mathematician named Al-Khwarizmi. His book was called The Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. Not exactly a catchy title, but it was revolutionary. It explained how to solve equations not by guesswork but by rules. He basically said, hey, if you move this term to the other side, you can balance the equation. Boom. Algebra was born. And here's the kicker. Al-Khwarizmi wasn't writing for fun. He wasn't dreaming of abstract mathematics. He was writing a guidebook for practical problems: inheritance, land division, business deals. The early chapters of algebra are soaked in money. If you're dividing an estate among 3 heirs, or calculating a loan with interest, you need algebra. This wasn't math for the classroom. This was math for survival. Think about it. If someone dies and leaves behind property, how do you divide it fairly among children, spouses, relatives, and creditors? You need rules. You need equations. Algebra gave medieval bankers and lawyers the tools to turn messy family drama into clean numbers. Yes, Cousin Ahmed, you do get 1/7 of the orchard. No, Cousin Fatima, you cannot demand half the goats. It says so right here in the equation. Algebra kept the peace, or at least prevented lawsuits from turning into sword fights. But algebra didn't just stay in inheritance courts. It spread into trade. Merchants needed to calculate profit margins, convert currencies, and figure out interest rates. Imagine you're in Baghdad in the year 1000. You lend 100 dinars at 10% interest. How much is owed after 3 years? With Roman numerals, you'd cry. With Hindu-Arabic numerals and algebra, you'd do it in a flash. Algebra was basically the calculator app of the medieval world. Now, here's where banking comes in. In medieval Italy, cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa were booming trade hubs. Merchants were sending ships all over the Mediterranean. Money was flowing, and with money came complexity. You needed to keep records, track debts, and balance accounts. This is where double-entry bookkeeping appears. Invented around the 13th century, it's the system we still use today. Every transaction is recorded twice. Once as a debit, once as a credit. That way the books always balance. If they don't, you know you've made a mistake, or someone's stealing. Double-entry bookkeeping is pure algebra in action. You're literally balancing equations every time you write an entry. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. It's simple, elegant, and powerful. In fact, historian Jacob Soll once said that double-entry bookkeeping changed the world as much as the printing press. And he's right. Without it, large-scale banking would be impossible. You can't run a bank if you can't keep track of who owes what. The system made it possible to manage money across continents, decades, even generations. Here's a fun story. The Medici family in Florence, those famous patrons of the arts, were also pioneers of banking. Their wealth didn't just come from art deals, it came from ledgers. The Medici perfected double-entry bookkeeping. They ran branches in multiple cities, transferring money across borders without physically moving coins. They created letters of credit, which are basically medieval credit cards. You could travel with a piece of paper and cash it in at a Medici branch far away, safe, secure, and powered by math. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, but the Medici bankers were balancing equations behind the scenes. And let's not forget, currency exchange. Medieval Europe had a crazy quilt of coins. Florins, ducats, pounds, shillings, groats, each with its own weight and purity. Converting between them was a nightmare, unless you had algebra. Bankers became human calculators, solving systems of equations to figure out fair exchange rates. Honestly, if you hate going to the airport currency counter today, just be glad you're not trying to convert Venetian ducats to Byzantine hyperpyra while factoring in fluctuating silver content. Algebra saved merchants from endless headaches. The humor in all this is that algebra The subject most students dread was once the superhero of finance. Today, when someone says algebra, you probably think of meaningless X's and Y's scribbled on a chalkboard. But back then, algebra was about cows, coins, and keeping your business alive. Imagine telling a medieval banker that kids in the future would groan about solving for X. He'd probably laugh and say, "Solving for X is literally how I fed my family." But algebra did more than help with bookkeeping. It changed the way people thought about numbers. Before algebra, math was mostly about specific numbers and problems. With algebra, numbers became symbols, placeholders, concepts. You could represent the unknown. You could generalize. That mental leap, turning numbers into letters, turning problems into formulas, was enormous. It opened the door to modern science, engineering, and economics. Algebra turned math from arithmetic into a language. And banking. Banking scaled that language into power. When you combine algebra with double-entry bookkeeping, you get the ability to manage wealth on a massive scale. You get multinational banks. You get global trade. You get capitalism. It's not a stretch to say algebra is the DNA of banking. Without it, the financial system collapses. With it, empires rise. Here's a little irony to wrap things up. Al-Khwarizmi, the man who gave us algebra, also gave us the word algorithm. His name, when Latinized, became algorithmi. That's where our word comes from. So the guy who wrote a book on solving equations not only launched algebra, but indirectly gave us algorithms, the core of computers, AI, and modern finance. Every time you see a stock trade executed by an algorithm on Wall Street, you're seeing the ghost of Al-Khwarizmi at work. A 9th century scholar from Baghdad is still running the show. So, let's tie it all together. Algebra wasn't born in a classroom. It was born in the marketplace, in inheritance disputes, in the ledgers of merchants. It was practical, it was financial, and it was revolutionary. Algebra gave bankers the tools to create modern banking, and banking gave algebra the stage to change the world. Together, they turned math into money, and money into power, and they did it with nothing more than a few letters, a few symbols, and a whole lot of balancing. If algebra was the practical math tool that fueled banking, then Fibonacci was the hype man who showed Europe how powerful numbers could really be. And yes, he's the rabbit guy. You've probably heard of the famous Fibonacci sequence, the one where rabbits multiply like, well, rabbits. But here's the twist. Fibonacci's real legacy isn't rabbits at all. It's money. His math book was a Trojan horse that snuck modern numbers into medieval Europe, changing trade forever. Let's meet the man, Leonardo of Pisa. Born around 1170, son of an Italian merchant, he later got the nickname Fibonacci, which basically means son of Bonacci. Imagine if your legacy for all time was that guy whose dad's name was Bonacci. Not super glamorous, but his math definitely was. His father worked at a trading post in North Africa, and young Leonardo tagged along. There, he was exposed to the Hindu Arabic numeral system, those sleek, efficient digits we use today. Compared to clunky Roman numerals, it was like seeing a sports car for the first time after a lifetime of riding donkeys. He was hooked. He saw how merchants in the Islamic world used these numbers for lightning-fast calculations, and he realized Europe was stuck in the math Stone Age. So, in 1202, he wrote a book, Liber Abazi, or the Book of Calculation. Don't be fooled by the dry title. This book was explosive. It was the user manual for modern math. Fibonacci laid out everything. How to use Hindu Arabic numerals, how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, work with fractions, calculate currency conversions, handle interest, and even evaluate profits. Basically, it was the medieval version of math for dummies, and it changed the game. Now, about those rabbits. In Liber Abazi, Fibonacci included a problem. If you start with one pair of rabbits, and they reproduce every month, how many pairs will you have after a year? The sequence that comes out of this 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13 and so on became legendary. But here's the funny part. Fibonacci himself wasn't obsessed with the sequence. He just threw it in as an example problem. To him, it was a side note. To us, it's his claim to fame. Poor guy. He wanted to revolutionize commerce, and instead history remembers him as the rabbit man. But the real heart of Liber Abaci was money. Fibonacci showed merchants how to convert currencies across regions. Remember, medieval Europe had dozens of local coins, each with its own value. Imagine trying to run a business where every city has its own monopoly money. You'd go insane. Fibonacci gave step-by-step instructions for conversions. He also showed how to calculate profits, losses, and interest. For merchants, this was pure gold. With his book, you could avoid being cheated, run bigger operations, and expand your business. Math wasn't abstract. It was survival. And here's where the humor comes in. Imagine a medieval merchant struggling with Roman numerals. He's trying to figure out if he made a profit on a shipment of wool. He writes CCL lacks 5 times 12 and stares at it until his eyes cross. Then someone hands him Liber Abaci. Suddenly, he's writing 264 catcher 12, done in seconds. He probably cried tears of joy. Fibonacci was the guy who walked into a medieval office and said, "Hey, stop using typewriters, here's a laptop." That's the scale of change. Fibonacci didn't just teach math tricks. He helped Europe trust the new system. People were skeptical at first. They thought Arabic numerals looked weird and dangerous. Zeros, especially, freaked them out. Authorities even banned them in some places because they were too easy to forge. You could turn a 0 into a 6 with a quick pen stroke. But Fibonacci kept showing how useful the system was. Slowly, merchants adopted it. And once merchants had it, bankers followed. And once bankers had it, governments followed. Within a couple of centuries, Roman numerals were basically decorative. Thank Fibonacci for that. The ripple effects were enormous. With better math, trade expanded. With better trade, wealth grew. With wealth came art, science, exploration, the whole Renaissance. You could say Fibonacci helped fund Michelangelo's paintbrush and Columbus's ships just by making math easier. Not a bad legacy for a guy remembered for bunnies. Speaking of bunnies, let's have some fun with the Fibonacci sequence. It shows up in surprising places. The spirals of sunflowers, the arrangement of pine cones, the pattern of hurricanes. Nature loves Fibonacci, which is wild, because Fibonacci himself probably never noticed. He wasn't out in fields staring at pineapples. He was in his study, figuring out how to convert Byzantine coins into Venetian ducats without losing his shirt. And yet today, artists, architects, and YouTubers all gush about the beauty of the Fibonacci sequence. Meanwhile, medieval merchants were like, "Cool story, but how do I calculate compound interest?" And here's another little twist. The Fibonacci sequence, while fascinating, wasn't new. Indian mathematicians had described similar patterns centuries earlier. Fibonacci just packaged it for a European audience. But sometimes timing is everything. His book arrived at the right place, at the right moment, and lit a fire under European commerce. He was a translator of ideas, a bridge builder. He took brilliant concepts from the East and sold them to the West. In a way, he was a math influencer. The irony is that Fibonacci didn't become famous in his own lifetime. He wasn't a celebrity mathematician. His books circulated among merchants and scholars, but he wasn't signing autographs in Pisa. His fame skyrocketed centuries later, when people rediscovered the sequence and slapped his name on it. The poor guy probably would have laughed if he knew his rabbits would outshine his actual mission. But hey, fame is fame. So let's bring this all together. Fibonacci wasn't just about numbers. He was about commerce. His Liber Abaci gave merchants the tools to thrive, using a number system that was faster, smarter, and more powerful than anything Europe had seen. He bridged cultures, spread ideas, and accidentally gave the world one of the most famous sequences in math. Rabbits may have multiplied, but so did money, and that's the real Fibonacci story. At the end of the day, Fibonacci shows us something important. Math isn't born in classrooms, it's born in marketplaces, on ships, in ledgers. It grows where people need it most, when they're trying not to get ripped off, or when they're trying to make a living. Math is about survival, and sometimes about rabbits too. Picture Europe around the 1400s. Castles, plagues, knights clanking around in armor, monks copying books by hand. It doesn't sound like a time when math was thriving. But then, boom, the Renaissance hits. Suddenly art, science, and trade are exploding. And right in the middle of it all is math. Numbers became fashionable, almost glamorous. For the first time, math wasn't just a tool for survival. It was culture, art, and even power. So what kicked it all off? The printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's invention around 1450 didn't just revolutionize books, it revolutionized numbers. Before the press, if you wanted a math book, a poor monk had to copy it by hand, carefully scratching numbers into parchment by candlelight. And if he sneezed, well, tough luck. Your 8 is now a 3. Books were rare, expensive, and prone to mistakes. But with the printing press, math books could spread across Europe like wildfire. Knowledge that once took decades to circulate could now travel in months. This was like switching from dial-up to broadband for human thought. And it wasn't just more books. It was better books. Imagine a geometry text with actual diagrams printed cleanly, instead of wobbly circles drawn by a tired scribe. Suddenly, math looked crisp and professional. The press standardized not just letters, but numbers. Merchants, scholars, and bankers across Europe could finally agree that 2 plus 2 equals 4, not a lot. This standardization mattered. It meant that trade, science, and even art could build on a shared numerical language. Now let's talk money. As trade expanded, currencies multiplied, every city had its own coins, weights, and measures. Chaos. Imagine trying to buy silk in Florence with Venetian coins, then hopping to Antwerp where they want ducats, then over to London where it's pounds, shillings, and pence. You'd need a math degree just to shop. And guess what? Merchants basically did. They carried handbooks filled with conversion tables, and these were printed and sold everywhere. The math of money became a bestseller genre. Forget romance novels. In the 1500s, hot new publications were guides on currency exchange. And with more trade came more math. Interest rates, loans, and investments required calculations. This was the age when banking really flexed its muscles. Families like the Medici in Florence were running banking empires, powered by ledgers, double-entry bookkeeping, and a lot of math. They funded art, exploration, and politics. Michelangelo may have painted the Sistine Chapel, but somebody had to calculate his paycheck. Behind every brushstroke was a banker with a ledger, checking the numbers. But here's where it gets fun. The Renaissance wasn't just about practical math. It was also about beauty. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci were obsessed with proportions. The golden ratio, symmetry, perspective. Math was woven into art. When you look at Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, you're looking at math in human form. Painters learned how to use perspective to make flat canvases look three-dimensional. That's geometry in action. Suddenly, math wasn't just about goats and taxes. It was about making the Mona Lisa smile in perfect proportions. And the obsession with beauty extended to architecture. Think of Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, building that required insane math skills. Calculating curves, stresses, and supports without modern engineering tools, that's genius. And it wasn't hidden math, it was celebrated. Renaissance architects bragged about their mathematical prowess the way modern tech companies brag about their algorithms. Look at my dome, it's mathematically perfect, and everyone swooned. Even music got the math treatment. Composers explored ratios and harmonics, building entire systems of tuning based on numbers. To Renaissance thinkers, math wasn't dry, it was the secret code of the universe, the language of God. Numbers were everywhere on canvases, in cathedrals, in symphonies. Imagine walking through Florence in 1500 and hearing a merchant haggling over exchange rates in one square, an artist drawing geometric grids in another, and a composer tuning strings according to precise ratios in the cathedral. Math was in the air. Of course, not everyone loved it. Plenty of ordinary people still found math intimidating. Merchants might grudgingly admit it was useful, but peasants probably didn't care about ratios of beauty. But the elite, the scholars, bankers and artists couldn't get enough. Math became a marker of sophistication. To know numbers was to be cultured. Imagine showing off at a dinner party by sketching a perfect perspective drawing of the table. That was Renaissance flexing. Here's a funny anecdote. In 1494, an Italian monk named Luca Pacioli published a book on math. In it, he described double-entry bookkeeping, making it famous, but he also gushed about the golden ratio, calling it divine. He even said it revealed the face of God in geometry. So, in one book, you had both accounting instructions and math as religion. That's the Renaissance in a nutshell, balancing your checkbook and contemplating the infinite, all in one sitting. And of course, exploration was booming. Columbus, Magellan, and others were sailing off into the unknown. Navigation required math. Geometry for maps, trigonometry for measuring stars, arithmetic for supplies. Without math, you didn't cross oceans. You got lost and probably eaten by seagulls. Renaissance explorers relied on numbers as much as compasses. Every voyage was a floating math problem. So, what's the big picture? The Renaissance of numbers wasn't about inventing math from scratch. It was about spreading it, standardizing it, and celebrating it. The printing press made math universal. Banking made it powerful. Art made it beautiful. Exploration made it global. Numbers went from being dusty scribbles in monasteries to being the pulse of civilization. And maybe the best part? For the first time, math wasn't just hidden in ledgers or whispered by merchants. It was public. It was glamorous. It was part of the culture. You could walk into a cathedral and see math in stone. You could open a book and see math in print. You could hear math in music. Numbers became not just practical tools, but part of the Renaissance vibe. They were cool. Well, as cool as math gets. So let's close this chapter. The Renaissance showed that math wasn't just about keeping accounts or paying taxes. It was about art, beauty, exploration, and the very structure of knowledge. It was a period when math got dressed up, went to the party, and stole the show. And thanks to that, Europe was ready for the next leap, the mathematics of risk, gambling, and the birth of probability. But that's a story for the next chapter. By the time the Renaissance wrapped up, Europe was buzzing with trade, art, exploration, and money. Merchants were richer, bankers were craftier, and mathematicians were, well, nerdier. But something was still missing, because once you've got banking and big trade, you run into a tricky question. How do you measure risk? How do you deal with chance? What happens when dice, cards, or storms at sea ruin your profits? This is where math took another leap. Out of gambling dens and smoky taverns came one of the most powerful tools in finance, probability theory. And yes, it started with people losing money at games of chance. Let's set the scene. It's the 1600s. Somewhere in France, gamblers are rolling dice. Nobles are playing cards. People are betting fortunes on games they don't really understand. And in walks Blaise Pascal, mathematician, philosopher, inventor, and part-time buzzkill. He gets a letter from a friend, the Chevalier de Mere, a gambler who's obsessed with dice. De Mere wants to know, how do you split winnings fairly if a game ends early? He's basically asking, what's the math behind a fair bet? Pascal starts thinking, and before you know it, he's inventing probability theory, all because someone didn't want to get cheated at dice. But Pascal wasn't alone. He teamed up with Pierre de Fermat, another math genius. They exchanged letters, solving dice problems, card problems, and more. Their correspondence is like the world's first gambling hotline, except instead of telling you to quit, they gave you equations. Together, they laid the foundation for probability, the idea that you can measure chance with numbers. Suddenly, luck wasn't just mystical, it was math. You could calculate odds, predict outcomes, and make informed bets. Gambling turned into science. And here's the kicker. Probability didn't stay in taverns. It leapt into commerce. Merchants realized that shipping goods across oceans was basically gambling. Would your ship make it or sink in a storm? Would pirates show up? Would your spices arrive moldy? Each voyage was a roll of the dice. And if you could calculate the odds, you could plan better. Probability became the math of risk, and that's where insurance was born. Take marine insurance in London. Merchants gathered in coffee houses like Lloyd's to talk shipping risks. One guy would say, "I'll cover your ship for this much money if you pay me a fee." Another would say, "I'll take part of that risk too." They were basically betting on whether your ship would make it back. But with probability theory, they could make those bets smart. They could price risk, spread it around, and still turn a profit. Insurance transformed gambling into business. And it worked so well that Lloyd's of London is still around today, insuring everything from ships to celebrity body parts, all thanks to math. And let's not forget the lotteries. Governments saw probability as a way to raise money. They sold lottery tickets, promising huge prizes. The odds were terrible, of course, but people loved it. Mathematicians studied lotteries, calculating expected value, basically the average payoff you'd get if you played 1,000,000 times. Spoiler, the house always wins, but the math of lotteries taught people about risk, expectation and fairness, and it gave governments a very profitable voluntary tax. Here's a fun story. In the 18th century, the famous St. Petersburg paradox was introduced. It goes like this. You flip a coin until it comes up heads. If it lands heads on the first flip, you win $2. If it takes 2 flips, you win $4. 3 flips, $8. 4 flips, $16, and so on, doubling forever. The expected value of this game is infinite, which means, mathematically, you should pay any price to play. But in reality, nobody would pay more than a few bucks. Why? Because humans don't think like equations. We hate risk even when the math says we shouldn't. This paradox sparked entire fields of economics, psychology and finance, all from a simple coin toss. Probability also changed warfare. Generals started using math to predict casualties, supplies and outcomes. It changed medicine too, with doctors calculating survival rates. But its biggest impact was in finance. Banks, insurers, and investors used probability to manage uncertainty. It made capitalism scalable. Without probability, modern finance is just blind luck. With it, you can model risk, set prices, and plan for the future. Probability turned chaos into spreadsheets. And let's talk about gambling again, because it never really left. Casinos became probability laboratories. Dice, cards, roulette, all playgrounds for math. Gamblers might think they're chasing luck, but the house is always calculating. The odds are stacked in favor of the casino. Always. That's why they can afford the chandeliers. Casinos are monuments to probability theory. Next time you walk into one, just remember, you're not beating the math. The math is beating you. Here's the humor in all of this. Imagine Pascal and Fermat, two of the brightest minds in history, hunched over dice problems while sipping wine. They probably thought they were just answering a friend's quirky question. Instead, they gave humanity the math of risk, the backbone of modern finance, and the reason we have car insurance, all because a gambler didn't want to get shortchanged. Sometimes the biggest revolutions start with the smallest annoyances. So what's the big picture? The calculus of commerce is about turning chance into numbers. It's about realizing that luck isn't random. It's measurable. From dice games to shipping routes, from lotteries to insurance, probability turned uncertainty into business. It made economies bigger, safer, and smarter. And it showed that math isn't just about certainty. Sometimes it's about managing the uncertain. Let's wrap this up. The Renaissance gave us beauty and proportion, but the 1600s gave us something even more powerful, the ability to measure risk. Probability theory turned gambling into science, and science into finance. It let us insure ships, build banks, and grow economies. It taught us that math doesn't just describe what is, it can predict what might be. And in doing so, it reshaped commerce forever. The calculus of commerce was born in taverns with dice, but it ended up running the global economy. By now, humanity has coins, banking, and even probability to manage risk. But let's be honest, not all money is created equal. Some money just feels shinier, and for thousands of years, nothing has glittered quite like gold. Gold has been the superstar of money, worshipped, hoarded, stolen, mined, and fought over. But why gold? Why not copper, or iron, or seashells, or, I don't know, squirrels? The answer, surprisingly, is math. The geometry of gold made it the perfect currency. Let's start with the obvious. Gold is rare, but not too rare. If it were as common as rocks, it wouldn't be valuable. If it were as rare as unicorn tears, nobody would use it as money. Gold sits in the mathematical sweet spot, scarce enough to be precious, common enough to be practical. That balance is what economists today call supply and demand. But the ancient world figured it out intuitively. They didn't need charts. They just saw gold sparkle in rivers and went, yep, that's the one. Gold also has perfect properties for currency. It doesn't rust, tarnish, or corrode. Leave it in a jar for 1,000 years, dig it up, and it still shines. Mathematically speaking, gold is chemically stable. You don't need an equation to know that a coin that doesn't rot is better than one that turns green in your pocket. Silver, by comparison, tarnishes. Copper corrodes. Iron rusts. Gold just stays gold. That kind of reliability is priceless in money. But here's where the geometry comes in. Gold is divisible. You can melt it, cut it, and reshape it into smaller pieces without losing value. Break a cow in half, and you've ruined the cow. Break a gold bar in half, and congratulations, you've got 2 smaller gold bars. This divisibility is a mathematical property, and it's essential for currency. Money has to be divisible into units, so you can pay for a loaf of bread as easily as a palace. Gold passed the test. Gold is also portable. Its density means a small amount carries a lot of value. Imagine carrying your wealth in bags of salt. You'd need a donkey. Carrying it in iron ingots. You'd need a wagon. Gold let you fit a fortune in a pouch at your belt. For traders and kings alike, portability was math in action. Maximum value per unit of weight. And then there's measurability. Gold can be weighed precisely. Put it on a scale and you know exactly how much you have. Other goods like cows or grain vary in quality. Not every cow is equal. Some are skinny, some are fat, some are moody, but every ounce of gold is the same as every other ounce. Uniformity makes gold mathematically predictable, which makes it trustworthy. In commerce, trust is everything. Now let's look at history. Ancient Egyptians were some of the earliest gold fanatics. They mined it along the Nile and used it for jewelry, temples, and trade. To them, gold was divine, the skin of the gods. But they didn't just admire it, they standardized it. They measured gold in units called deben, making it part of their economy. Geometry in action, chunks of gold carefully weighed, exchanged for goods. Fast forward to the Greeks. They minted gold coins stamped with gods and heroes. For them, gold wasn't just money. It was propaganda. A gold coin with Alexander the Great's face wasn't just currency. It was a statement. This guy rules you, and also your wallet. Math and politics danced together on shiny little discs. And then Rome, of course, couldn't resist. Roman gold coins, the aureus, became the backbone of their empire. Soldiers were paid in gold, taxes were collected in gold, and emperors used gold to show off their power. The math of gold kept the empire running until emperors got greedy. They started debasing coins, mixing in cheaper metals while keeping the face value the same. Imagine being paid in chocolate coins wrapped in gold foil. They look real, but inside they're junk. This inflation by debasement eventually helped wreck the Roman economy. A mathematical betrayal, literally baked into the coins. But gold kept bouncing back. In the Middle Ages, it became the foundation of trade across continents. The florin, minted in Florence in 1252, became an international standard. The Venetian ducat followed. These coins were so trusted that merchants across Europe, Africa, and Asia accepted them without question. Why? Because they were consistently pure, consistently measured. Once again, math equals trust. If a coin weighed the right amount of gold, you could trade it anywhere. Now, let's zoom out. Gold's geometry didn't just make it good money, it made it symbolic. When nations later built the gold standard, they literally tied their currencies to precise amounts of gold. $1 equals this many grams of gold. £1 equals this many. The system was pure math, stable, predictable, and global. For centuries, gold anchored the world's economy, until of course governments decided it was inconvenient and ditched it. But even today, people still measure value in gold. It's the shiny yardstick of wealth. And here's a fun irony. Gold is mathematically perfect for money, but it's practically useless for anything else. You can't eat it, you can't build with it, you can't power your house with it. Yet we love it because math says it's reliable, divisible, portable, and rare. Humanity took the most useless metal and made it the most important, simply because the numbers lined up. It's like the universe said, here's a shiny metal with perfect properties, and humans said, yes please, I'll build civilization with that. Let's sprinkle in some humor. Imagine being an ancient gold prospector, knee-deep in a river, panning for tiny flakes. After hours of work, you hold up a nugget and shout, I'm rich. Meanwhile, your neighbor picks up a shiny rock that turns out to be pyrite, fool's gold. The math of density separates the winners from the losers. Gold sinks heavier in water, pyrite doesn't. So the first get-rich-quick scams of history were geological math tests. And think about pirates. When they buried treasure, it was always gold. Never copper, never wheat, never salt. Why? Because only gold kept its value over centuries. Imagine digging up a pirate chest of salt after 200 years. Not impressive, but gold coins. Still gleaming. Pirates were basically amateur economists, trusting in the geometry of gold. So let's wrap this up. Gold became money not because it was shiny, but because it was mathematically perfect. Rare but not too rare. Divisible, portable, measurable, incorruptible. The geometry of gold made it the universal currency, from pharaohs to pirates to bankers. It built empires, funded wars, and anchored economies. And even today, when most of our money is just digital numbers in a bank, people still look to gold as the ultimate safe haven. When in doubt, humans trust math. And gold is math you can hold in your hand. Gold was shiny, reliable, and mathematically perfect for money. But let's be real, carrying around sacks of gold isn't fun. Try running through a marketplace with 30 gold coins jangling in your pouch. Every pickpocket within 10 miles is suddenly your best friend. And don't even think about sending gold across continents. That's how you end up funding a pirate's retirement plan. Eventually, humanity realized something important. Maybe we don't need the gold itself. Maybe we just need a promise that the gold exists somewhere safe. And thus, paper money was born, the world's first financial magic trick, turning promises into wealth. Our story begins in China, around the Tang Dynasty's 7th-9th century. Merchants there were dealing with the same old problem. Coins are heavy. Copper coins, strung together with rope, could weigh more than the goods they were buying. Imagine trying to buy a cart of rice, but having to carry 2 carts of coins to pay for it. At some point, someone thought, what if we just leave the coins in a safe place and carry a slip of paper that says how many coins we own? Genius. Suddenly, your wealth could fit in your pocket without breaking your back. The earliest paper notes were called jiaozi. They weren't issued by the government at first. Private merchants made them. Basically, a trustworthy shopkeeper would say, "Leave your coins with me. Here's a note saying you own them. Bring it back later, and I'll give you your coins." It worked because of trust. The paper itself was worthless, but the promise behind it, the math of X coins equals sign 1 slip, was valuable. This was money 2.0. By the Song Dynasty 11th century, the Chinese government said, "We'll take it from here," and started issuing official paper currency. That's when things got wild. For the first time in history, an empire was running on paper money. People could trade across provinces with notes instead of wagons full of coins. The economy boomed. It was light, efficient, and easy. Paper money was like switching from dial-up to Wi-Fi for trade. But let's not romanticize it too much. Paper money had its problems. Governments quickly realized they could print more notes than they had coins to back them. Instant wealth. Until, of course, everyone noticed that the notes weren't worth the promised metal anymore. Inflation hit. At one point, the Yuan dynasty printed so much paper money that it collapsed their economy. The Mongols could conquer half the world, but they couldn't conquer bad accounting. Turns out, you can't just copy-paste wealth. Math demands balance. Meanwhile, in Europe, people were still lugging around gold and silver. They eventually caught on to the paper trick through merchants and bankers. In medieval Italy, letters of credit became popular. The Medicis used them to let travelers access money without carrying coins. You'd deposit gold in Florence, get a letter, and cash it in at a Medici branch in London or Bruges. It was basically the medieval version of a debit card, safer, smarter, and much harder for pirates to steal. By the 17th century, banks started issuing actual banknotes. Sweden's Stockholm's Banco was the first in 1661. At first, these were just receipts for deposited coins, but soon banks realized people rarely came back for the gold. So why not issue more notes than they had gold? As long as everyone didn't demand their gold at once, the system worked. And so fractional reserve banking was born, a fancy way of saying, "We have some of the gold we promise. Please don't all ask for it at the same time." To this day, banks still run on that math trick. And this is where the real magic of paper money appears, because what's happening here is pure abstraction. You're no longer holding wealth. You're holding a symbol of wealth, a promise, a mathematical relationship. 1 note equals this much gold, or, eventually, 1 note equals whatever the government says it equals. It's trust, written down. The paper is worthless, but the system behind it makes it priceless. Here's a funny thought. Imagine the first guy to get paid with paper money. He goes home and shows his wife. "Look, honey, they gave me these pieces of paper instead of silver coins." She probably stared at him like he'd been scammed, but when she used it at the market and it worked, she was hooked. Suddenly, the world was lighter. Money was no longer heavy metal. It was promises floating around in ink. The humor, of course, is that humans are both genius and gullible. We created a system where trust is everything. As long as everyone believes the paper has value, it works. But the moment that trust wobbles, chaos erupts. That's why governments guarded paper money like a sacred ritual. Special inks, seals, signatures, early versions of anti-counterfeiting. Because if fake notes spread, trust collapsed. Paper money was fragile. but when it worked, it was revolutionary. By the 18th and 19th centuries, paper money had spread across Europe and beyond. Nations tied their notes to gold reserves, creating the famous gold standard. £1 note equals this much gold in the vault. It was math written into law. People trusted the notes because they trusted the equation. But eventually, governments realized they didn't need gold at all. They could declare value by fiat, by decree. That's why today we call it fiat money. A dollar is worth a dollar because the government says so. And because everyone agrees, it's not math in metal anymore, it's math in psychology. And yet, the math never went away. Even fiat money is still a balance sheet. Numbers in circulation, numbers in reserves, numbers in debts and credits. It's still trust disguised as math. Every paper bill you've ever touched is a receipt for a story told in numbers. It's clay tablets, 2.0, gold coins, 3.0, and now paper 4.0. Each step more abstract, each step more powerful. Let's sprinkle in a little joke here. The first receipts were basically proto-Excel sheets. Dear sir, you have deposited 10 coins, and here's your receipt. Please don't lose it. Fast forward to today, and we're still doing the same thing, just with fancier fonts. You check your bank balance online, and it's basically a digital receipt saying, don't worry, your money's here probably. So let's wrap this chapter. The rise of paper promises was humanity's leap from physical money to abstract money, from carrying wealth to carrying symbols, from gold in your hand to trust in your pocket. Paper money lightened economies, expanded trade, and made banking global. But it also showed us a deeper truth. Money isn't metal or paper or even numbers. Money is trust, written down in mathematical form, and as long as that trust holds, the paper is as good as gold until it isn't. If paper money was humanity's big trust me bro moment, then interest was the math that made money grow, or shrink, depending on which side of the deal you were on. Debt is one of the most powerful and dangerous mathematical inventions of all time. It builds empires, funds exploration, and also ruins lives. It's basically math with teeth, and its history is a roller coaster of genius, greed, and a few very angry peasants. Let's start simple. Debt is just borrowing. You take something now, promise to give it back later. But humans being humans, we added a twist. Interest. The borrower doesn't just return what they took, they return more. The extra is the lender's reward for waiting, for taking the risk. It's math applied to time. A cow today is worth more than a cow next year because you could have milked that cow for 12 months. Interest is math's way of saying, pay me for the time you wasted my cow. Ancient Mesopotamia already had loans and interest thousands of years ago. Archaeologists have found clay tablets recording debts of barley and silver with interest attached. Some even specify repayment schedules. One tablet basically says, you borrowed grain, you owe back grain plus 20%. Congratulations, you've just signed history's first student loan, and yes, the interest rate is brutal. Farmers often fell into cycles of debt they could never escape, which is why ancient societies sometimes declared debt jubilees, wiping the slate clean. Imagine if modern governments did that. Every few decades, all your debts disappear. Your credit card company would have a collective heart attack. But not everyone liked interest. The ancient Hebrews banned usury, charging excessive interest in their laws. The Greeks debated it. Aristotle himself said making money from money was unnatural because coins don't reproduce. Clearly, he never heard of compound interest. For centuries, religious authorities frowned on lending with interest. The Bible, the Quran, and the Church all placed restrictions. But here's the thing. Society kept lending anyway, because without loans, economies stall. You can't build big projects, fund voyages, or run businesses without borrowing. People needed debt, whether the philosophers liked it or not. By the Middle Ages, Workarounds popped up. Christian Europe banned usury. So clever bankers invented fees, partnerships, and other names for what was basically interest in disguise. Meanwhile, Jewish and later Italian bankers filled the lending gap. Money lending became controversial but essential. Kings who condemned interest on Sunday were borrowing from bankers on Monday. Hypocrisy has always been the real world's favorite math trick. And then along came compound interest. This is the killer app of finance. The idea is simple. You earn interest not just on your original loan, but also on the interest it generates. Over time, the growth snowballs. Albert Einstein supposedly called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world. Whether he actually said that or not, the point stands: compound interest is ridiculously powerful. It can turn small savings into fortunes or small debts into disasters. Here's a quick thought experiment. Imagine you lend someone $100 at 5% interest, compounded yearly. After 1 year, they owe $105. The next year, they owe interest not just on the $100 but on the $105. After 20 years, the debt has nearly tripled. At 10% interest, it explodes. That's why bankers love compound interest and borrowers dread it. It's like a mathematical time machine that either works for you or against you. The age of exploration was basically powered by loans and interest. Voyages were expensive, ships, supplies, crews, merchants pooled money, borrowed more, and promised investors a cut of the profits. Columbus's trip to the New World, funded by Spanish monarchs and bankers, with the expectation of massive returns. Debt literally launched ships across oceans. Without loans, half of history's big adventures wouldn't have left the harbour. But debt also fueled disasters. Monarchs often borrowed too much, then defaulted. Spain, despite plundering mountains of gold and silver from the Americas, declared bankruptcy multiple times in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's right, the richest empire in Europe was broke, because it couldn't manage its loans. It's like winning the lottery and still maxing out your credit cards. The math of debt doesn't care about pride. If you borrow recklessly, it eats you alive. Now let's bring some humor in. Debt is like fire. Use it carefully, and it cooks your dinner. Use it recklessly, and it burns down your house. Or in Spain's case, your empire. Modern people know this feeling all too well. Swipe a credit card too often, and suddenly you're living in a personal debt tragedy. Ancient kings defaulted on kingdoms. We default on pizza deliveries. Same math, different stakes. And then there's the human side of debt. For most people in history, debt wasn't about voyages or empires. It was about survival. A farmer borrowing grain to plant next season. A family borrowing to survive a bad harvest. Debt was a lifeline, but also a trap. High interest rates often pushed people into bondage. In some societies, if you couldn't repay, you became a debt slave. Suddenly, math wasn't just numbers on a tablet. It was your freedom. Over time, societies realized they needed balance. Too much debt, and peasants revolt. Too little, and trade dries up. Laws evolved, interest rates were capped, and eventually credit systems became more regulated. Today, we live in a world where debt is everywhere. Student loans, mortgages, government bonds, entire nations run on borrowed money. Modern economies are basically elaborate juggling acts of debt. But the principle is still the same as in Mesopotamia. Borrow now, repay later. Plus extra, same math, bigger numbers. And here's the irony. Debt feels modern, but it's as old as civilization. The same anxieties we feel about mortgages or loans today were felt by farmers thousands of years ago staring at clay tablets. Debt is timeless. The numbers change, the interest rates shift, the contracts get fancier. But the story is the same: math, time, and trust colliding. So let's wrap this chapter. Interest and debt transformed money from something static into something dynamic. They let wealth grow, projects expand, and trade flourish. But they also carried risks. ruining kingdoms, crushing peasants, and sparking revolts. Debt is math with power, math that multiplies, math that punishes. It's a tool and a trap, and in the end, it shows us something profound. Math doesn't just count wealth. Sometimes math creates it, and sometimes math destroys it. By now, math has given us coins, banking, algebra, interest, and even paper promises. But money isn't just about counting and storing value. It's about uncertainty. The future is messy, risky, unpredictable. Ships sink, crops fail, markets crash, dice roll the wrong way. Humans hate uncertainty. So we did what we always do when life confuses us. We threw math at it. Welcome to the statistical revolution. The moment when probability grew up, put on a suit, and started running the economy. Let's rewind a bit. Remember Pascal and Fermat? Those two French guys who turned gambling problems into probability theory? Well, their little dice hobby snowballed. By the 1700s, mathematicians across Europe were obsessed with measuring chance. They weren't just asking, what's the probability of rolling a 6? They were asking, what's the probability of living to 60? Of a ship making it across the Atlantic? Of a lottery ticket paying off? Probability escaped the tavern and marched into insurance offices, government offices, and eventually Wall Street. Enter Jacob Bernoulli, a Swiss mathematician from a family where everyone seemed to either do math or become a clergyman. In 1713, after years of scribbling in notebooks, he published Ars Conjectandi, The Art of Conjecture. The title alone sounds like a magician's spellbook. In it, Bernoulli laid down the foundations of probability as a science. He introduced what we now call the law of large numbers, the idea that while individual events are unpredictable, large groups behave predictably. Flip one coin, who knows? Flip 1,000, and you'll get about half heads, half tails. Uncertainty tamed by math. This was revolutionary. It meant you could predict the unpredictable, at least in the aggregate. You couldn't say when one person would die, but you could say how many out of 1,000 people would die in a given year. Grim, yes, but also incredibly useful. This is the birth of actuarial science, the math of life and death, used by insurance companies to set premiums. Suddenly, your lifespan was a number in a table, your risks calculated by statisticians who never met you. Romantic? No. Practical? Absolutely. And speaking of insurance, let's talk about lotteries again. Governments loved them because they raised money without raising taxes. Mathematicians studied them to understand expected value, the average payoff, and gamblers loved them because hope is addictive. Bernoulli himself analyzed the famous St. Petersburg paradox, where the expected value of a coin flip game is infinite, but nobody in their right mind would pay much to play. This revealed something crucial. Humans don't value risk mathematically. We value it emotionally. We fear losses more than we crave gains. That insight would later give birth to behavioral economics. But even in the 1700s, mathematicians were already scratching their heads over why humans are such bad calculators of risk. Let's pause for some humor. Imagine a medieval lottery ticket seller saying, "Buy a ticket. The math says you'll definitely lose, but maybe not this time." And everyone still buys one. Honestly, not much has changed. Modern lotteries are basically taxes on people who are bad at probability. But hey, they keep funding public schools. Now, here's another character. Abraham de Moivre, a French mathematician who fled to England. He wrote The Doctrine of Chances in 1718, a book that basically said, here's how to gamble smart. But hidden in his gambling math was something bigger. The beginnings of the normal distribution, the famous bell curve. He noticed that when you look at large amounts of data, outcomes tend to cluster around an average, with fewer and fewer results at the extremes. That curve became the backbone of statistics. Today, it's everywhere in finance, biology, psychology, even test scores. If you've ever been told you're average, blame de Moivre and his bell curve. The 18th century was when governments got in on the act. They started collecting data: births, deaths, marriages, disease rates. This political arithmetic, as it was called, turned into statistics, and with statistics came power. If you know how many citizens you have, how many soldiers you can draft, how many people might die in a famine, you can govern better, or at least control people better. Numbers turned populations into spreadsheets, and rulers loved it. Math wasn't just about markets anymore, it was about managing entire societies. And of course, finance gobbled it up. Banks and insurers realized that with enough data you could price risk. A ship to the Indies has a 1 in 10 chance of sinking. Fine, charge a 10% premium. A 40-year-old man has a 1 in 100 chance of dying next year. Price his life insurance accordingly. Risk turned into numbers, and numbers turned into profit. The uncertainty of life became a business model. Here's a quirky story. The first life insurance policies were offered in London coffee houses in the late 1600s. Groups of men would literally bet on how long someone would live. It sounds morbid, but it was also genius. Soon actuarial tables were created to make it fair. If you were young and healthy, your premiums were low; old and sick, high. Eventually, insurance became respectable, but its roots were literally in gambling on death. Nothing says statistical revolution like a room full of merchants sipping coffee and betting on mortality. The beauty of this era is that probability and statistics transformed chaos into something manageable. Ships sank, crops failed, dice rolled, but math gave humans a way to cope. It didn't eliminate risk, but it quantified it, and once quantified, it could be priced, insured, and traded. Finance became less about luck and more about calculation. Of course, people still lost fortunes, but now at least they had tables and graphs to explain why. So what's the big picture? The statistical revolution made money smarter. It gave us actuarial science, insurance, lotteries, and data-driven governance. It turned chance into charts, uncertainty into premiums, and risk into profit. It showed us that while individuals are unpredictable, crowds are predictable, and that insight built modern finance. Without it, capitalism would be a dice game. With it, capitalism became a carefully calculated casino. Let's wrap it up. Statistics took the gambler's hunch and turned it into a science. It showed us that math doesn't just count what we know, it measures what we don't. The statistical revolution was the bridge from the chaos of luck to the order of probability, and it laid the groundwork for the next stage, the industrial age, when math would become the engine driving growth, railroads and insurance companies that somehow still make you feel like you're losing, even when you're winning. By the 1800s, the world was buzzing with steam engines, railroads, and factories. The industrial age had arrived, and with it came a tidal wave of new problems: how to move goods across continents, how to price new technologies, how to manage booming populations in cities that suddenly smelled like coal and ambition. The glue holding it all together: math. The industrial age was the moment when math stopped being just a sidekick to money and became the actual engine running the show. Let's start with railroads. Imagine trying to build a railway line across a continent. You need to know how much steel, how much wood, how many workers, how much it will cost, and how many tickets you'll need to sell to break even. That's not just engineering, it's accounting on steroids. Railroads were math machines. They relied on timetables, cost calculations, interest payments, and stock offerings. Investors bought shares, governments demanded taxes, passengers demanded punctuality. A late train wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a mathematical error rippling through the system. Speaking of shares, this was the golden age of the stock market. Companies selling shares in railroads and factories needed capital, and investors needed math to figure out if they'd get rich or get swindled. Balance sheets, dividends, and compound growth became the language of industry. If the Renaissance merchant needed multiplication to survive, The Victorian investor needed statistics. Entire fortunes were made and lost on spreadsheets. Okay, not actual spreadsheets yet. More like big dusty ledgers, but you get the idea. Insurance also grew up during this period. Ships still sank, fires still burned, but now factories exploded and trains derailed too. Actuaries, those mysterious math wizards who calculate risk, became crucial. They crunched data on accidents, life expectancy and disasters to set premiums. If your factory had a higher chance of catching fire because you stored dynamite next to the coffee room, your insurance bill skyrocketed. Industrial math was unforgiving. And then came life insurance. By the 19th century, middle-class families wanted security. What happens if Dad, the breadwinner, kicks the bucket early? Enter life insurance companies with thick actuarial tables. They used math to calculate exactly how much you should pay monthly so your family would be covered. On paper, it looked fair. In reality, companies sometimes fudged numbers or underestimated risks. Still, the principle stuck. Math gave families peace of mind at a price. Now let's talk about communication. The telegraph was the 19th century internet, and it turned finance into a global speed game. Before, you'd send letters by ship and wait weeks for news. Now, prices in London could be transmitted to New York in minutes. Stock prices, gold values, crop reports, all numbers zipping across wires. Suddenly, math wasn't just about local ledgers. It was about instant global data. Traders became math sprinters, racing to profit from the latest numbers. Here's where it gets funny. Telegraph operators in finance hubs basically became early-day hackers. They memorized stock codes, sometimes leaked prices to friends, and generally behaved exactly like modern insiders, just with more Morse code. Finance and math together created a new kind of speed addiction. The faster you knew the numbers, the richer you got. Let's sprinkle in an anecdote. In 1866, the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable was laid. Suddenly, stock exchanges in London and New York were linked within minutes. Investors knew global prices. Imagine being a trader in New York before the cable. You'd wait weeks for news from London, gamble on rumors, and probably drink a lot out of stress. After the cable, you could lose your money in real time. Progress. But the industrial age wasn't just about finance. It was also about growth, and math became the science of predicting it. Economists like Thomas Malthus tried to model population growth, warning that people would multiply faster than food supplies. Spoiler, he was partly wrong, but the attempt was groundbreaking. Others calculated economic cycles, trying to tame the chaos of booms and busts. Statistics became the new oracle. Governments collected data on everything: population, trade, crime, health. The modern census became a mathematical portrait of entire nations. Factories themselves ran on numbers. Managers tracked output per worker, cost per unit, hours worked, wages paid. Early industrialists basically invented spreadsheets on paper. Some even developed scientific management, breaking down tasks into tiny steps, timing workers with stopwatches, and calculating efficiency. It was math applied to human bodies. Workers hated it, but profits loved it. Suddenly, you weren't just a blacksmith. You were 0.7, 3 units of productivity per hour. Congratulations. And let's not forget actuarial science's cousin, statistics for public health. Industrial cities were overcrowded, filthy, and disease-ridden. Governments needed data to respond. How many people died of cholera this year? What neighborhoods had the highest infant mortality? Numbers turned tragedy into policy. The industrial age birthed modern epidemiology, not because leaders cared deeply about people, but because they wanted to keep workers alive enough to run machines. Math wasn't sentimental, but it was practical. Now, here's the irony. The Industrial Revolution created unimaginable wealth, but it also created new financial disasters. Stock market bubbles inflated and popped. Railway manias bankrupted investors. Banks collapsed when too many people demanded their money at once. Math was supposed to make everything predictable, but greed always ran faster than equations. Still, without math, the whole machine would have collapsed completely. With math, at least some people got rich, while others went broke. So what's the big picture here? The industrial age transformed math from a background tool into the engine of money. Railroads needed math. Factories needed math. Stock markets, insurance companies, governments all ran on calculations. Math became industrialized. It was no longer just scribbles in a scholar's notebook. It was the pulse of entire economies, the backbone of new technologies, the fuel of globalization. And here's the humor. While mathematicians dreamed of pure theorems, industrialists just wanted to know how many tons of coal they needed. Math went from philosophy to logistics, from what is truth to how many bolts does it take to keep this train from exploding. Honestly, it was a glow-up. Math became blue-collar, sweaty, and ridiculously important. Let's close this chapter. The industrial age was a math revolution hidden in steam and steel. Numbers ran trains, priced insurance, tracked populations, and fueled stock exchanges. Math wasn't just helping money anymore. It was money's engine, keeping the machine running for better or worse. And as the 20th century dawned, the stakes would get even higher, because when equations met the chaos of global markets and human optimism, math would sometimes fail spectacularly. By the early 20th century, humanity thought we had money all figured out. We had banks, we had insurance, we had railroads and telegraphs, and we had math, lots of math. Economists were building shiny new equations to describe markets. Traders were scribbling graphs, and governments were convinced they could tame the chaos of money with numbers. Spoiler, they couldn't, because then came the Great Depression. And nothing exposes the limits of math like watching an entire global economy collapse in slow motion. Let's rewind to the 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties. Stock markets were booming. Factories were churning out cars, radios, and refrigerators. Jazz was blaring. People believed modern finance had solved all the old problems. Equations, statistics, and balance sheets seemed to promise endless growth. If you asked an economist in 1928, they'd tell you, we've entered a new era of stability. If you asked in 1929, they'd probably be selling apples on the street. The problem wasn't that math disappeared. The problem was that people misused it. Investors relied on formulas to value stocks, but the formulas assumed markets were rational. Spoiler number 2, humans are not rational. They get greedy. They panic. They stampede. Stock prices rose higher and higher, detached from reality. Equations kept saying, sure, looks fine, while common sense should have said, wait, why is this shoeshine boy giving stock tips? Even economists like Irving Fisher, one of the greatest minds of the time, famously declared in October 1929 that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. 2 weeks later, the market crashed. Permanently high plateau, meet permanently crushed dreams. On October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market imploded. Billions of dollars vanished in days. Investors who thought math had their backs suddenly realized, math can't stop a stampede. People sold everything in panic, dragging the market down further. The numbers were brutal. The Dow Jones lost nearly 90% of its value in just a few years. Imagine your $100,000 portfolio turning into $10,000. That's not math. That's heartbreak with decimal points. And the crash was just the beginning. Banks failed as people demanded their deposits back. Remember fractional reserve banking, where banks only keep a fraction of deposits in reserve? That system works great until everyone shows up at once. Then the math collapses. Bank runs spread like wildfire. People lined up outside banks, desperate to withdraw savings that no longer existed. It didn't matter what the equations said. Trust had evaporated. And without trust, money is just paper. The ripple effects were devastating. Businesses closed, unemployment skyrocketed, trade collapsed, farmers burned crops because they couldn't sell them, while families starved. The US unemployment rate hit 25%. Global economies spiraled downward. And here's the kicker. Economists were largely helpless. Their equations hadn't predicted this. Their models didn't know how to handle mass panic, debt defaults, and collapsing confidence. It turns out you can't divide optimism by infinity and get a stable economy. Here's a bit of humor in the tragedy. People started distrusting even the most basic math. Stock tickers, once symbols of progress, were now symbols of ruin. Bankers who had bragged about their clever equations became villains. Politicians scrambled, promising solutions that often made things worse. And ordinary folks joked darkly. I knew I should have kept my money under the mattress. In fairness, during the Depression, the mattress was outperforming Wall Street by a wide margin. The Great Depression taught a painful lesson. Math is only as good as the assumptions behind it. Economists assumed markets were rational and self-correcting. They assumed people made logical decisions. They assumed debt could always be repaid eventually. When reality didn't match those assumptions, the equations failed spectacularly. It was a reminder that numbers are tools, not magic spells. They can't predict human panic or greed. But out of the wreckage came innovation. Economists like John Maynard Keynes argued that governments needed to step in, spend money, and stabilize economies. This was controversial. Some thought it was mathematical heresy. But Keynes's ideas reshaped modern economics. He introduced models that accounted for uncertainty, demand, and psychology. In other words, math had to evolve. It couldn't just assume perfect markets anymore. It had to wrestle with messy humans. Finance also changed. Regulators created new rules to prevent another crash: deposit insurance, central bank oversight, stock market regulations. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about guardrails. Numbers had failed, so institutions stepped in. The Great Depression made people skeptical of financial equations, but it also forced finance to grow up. Risk couldn't be eliminated, but it could be managed better. And let's not forget the cultural impact. For decades, the Great Depression scarred people's relationship with money. Grandparents who lived through it often hoarded cash, distrusted banks, and clipped coupons religiously. To them, numbers weren't abstract. Numbers were survival. A few dollars meant dinner. A missed paycheck meant disaster. Math wasn't just in textbooks. It was in kitchen tables covered with bills and unpaid debts. Now, here's a lighter anecdote. During the Depression, Monopoly became a hit board game. Families who had no money of their own played a game about buying property and charging rent. It was escapism, sure, but also ironic. People who couldn't pay the mortgage in real life were gleefully foreclosing on their siblings in the living room. Math as therapy, cardboard edition. So what's the big picture here? The Great Depression revealed the limits of equations. Finance had grown too confident, too dependent on models that ignored human behavior. When panic struck, the math broke. The world learned that numbers can describe economies, but they can't guarantee stability. Trust, psychology, and human irrationality are just as important as interest rates and balance sheets. Let's wrap this chapter. The Great Depression was the moment math stumbled. It showed us that equations can fail, markets can collapse, and optimism can't be graphed forever. But it also forced finance and economics to evolve, blending math with psychology, regulation, and realism. The failure of equations wasn't the end of math in money. It was a reboot. And as the 20th century marched forward, a new kind of math would rise to take its place. Computers, algorithms, and Wall Street wizards were waiting in the wings, ready to promise, once again, that this time the numbers had it all under control. After the chaos of the Great Depression, finance slowly rebuilt itself with new rules, new theories, and a whole lot of caution. But by the mid-20th century, a new player entered the stage: the computer. And suddenly finance wasn't just about ledgers, equations, or even human intuition anymore. It was about algorithms, step-by-step instructions that could run faster, longer, and more accurately than any human brain. Wall Street was about to become a playground for math wizards with machines. Let's start with the basics. An algorithm is just a recipe. Add this, subtract that, repeat until done. Sounds simple, but computers could run millions of these steps in seconds. For finance, that was revolutionary. In the 1960s and 70s, big clunky computers started showing up in banks. At first, they just handled routine tasks, processing checks, calculating interest, balancing accounts. Boring stuff, but it freed humans from endless hours of ledger work. Finance was being automated, one punch card at a time. Then the real fun began. Mathematicians and economists started feeding financial models into computers. One of the most famous was the Black-Scholes model, developed in 1973 by Fisher Black, Myron Scholes, and Robert Merton. Their equation let you calculate the fair price of an option, a kind of financial bet on whether a stock will go up or down. Traders had been guessing at this for centuries. Suddenly, math gave them a formula. It was like handing gamblers a cheat sheet. The model was so influential that Scholes and Merton won the Nobel Prize. Black didn't, only because he had died by then, which feels like the most depressing footnote in finance history. The Black-Scholes model made options and derivatives explode in popularity. Entire markets grew around them. But here's the irony. While the formula looked elegant on paper, reality wasn't always so neat. Markets are messy. Assumptions break down. Still, the model gave Wall Street confidence, and confidence is half the game. Traders became wizards, waving equations like magic wands, conjuring profits out of thin air. Or so they thought. By the 1980s and 90s, computers had gotten faster, smaller, and cheaper. Wall Street wasn't just using them, they were worshipping them. Quantitative analysts, or quants, became rock stars. These were mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists who applied advanced models to trading. Forget gut feelings or cigar-chomping brokers shouting on the floor. The new kings of Wall Street were nerds with PhDs and algorithms. They built strategies based on tiny statistical patterns, exploiting inefficiencies too small for humans to notice. And with computers, they could execute trades in milliseconds. This gave rise to high-frequency trading. Imagine thousands of trades happening every second, algorithms battling each other for microscopic profits. It's like watching two supercomputers play ping-pong with billions of dollars. For ordinary investors, it looked insane. For the quants, it was just math at the speed of light. In fact, by the 21st century, most stock trades were no longer made by humans at all. They were made by algorithms. The wizards had taken over. Here's a humorous thought. If a medieval merchant from Fibonacci's time walked onto a modern trading floor, he'd faint. Back then, trading was yelling about sheep prices. Today, it's racks of servers blinking in dark rooms, quietly making millions. The math hasn't just gotten more complex, it's gotten invisible. You don't even see the trades anymore. They happen faster than your brain can blink. But let's not romanticize it. Algorithms are powerful, but they're also dangerous. They follow rules blindly, without judgment. In 2010, the flash crash showed how fragile the system could be. Within minutes, the Dow Jones plunged nearly 1,000 points, erasing about $1 trillion in market value, before bouncing back just as quickly. The cause? Algorithms gone wild, feeding off each other in a loop. It was like watching robots panic, and humans could only stand by and gasp. The lesson: when money moves faster than thought, even small glitches can turn into avalanches. And yet, the allure of algorithmic finance keeps growing. Hedge funds like Renaissance Technologies, founded by mathematician Jim Simons, made billions by applying sophisticated models. Simons himself wasn't a banker, he was a codebreaker and geometry genius. But he realized markets were just noisy datasets waiting to be cracked. His fund's algorithms were so successful they made him one of the richest men on earth. Wall Street's wizards weren't in suits, they were in hoodies, staring at equations. Here's the kicker. Most people still don't understand what these algorithms do. They're black boxes, spitting out trades that even their creators can't fully explain. Finance has become a faith system, where investors trust the math priests behind the curtain. It's Mesopotamian clay tablets all over again. Just swap the scribe's stylus for a supercomputer. And it's not just stocks. Algorithms run credit scores, loan approvals, insurance pricing, even fraud detection. Every time you swipe your card or apply for a mortgage, somewhere in the background an algorithm is judging you. Math doesn't just move markets, it judges your life. Comforting, right? Of course, this raises philosophical questions. Are we still in control of money, or have we handed the reins to our own math creations? Quants design the formulas, but once unleashed, they take on lives of their own. Algorithms don't care about human consequences. They just optimize. They'll happily crash a market if the math says it's profitable in the microsecond. Finance has become less about human decision-making and more about machine speed. It's capitalism on autopilot. Let's sprinkle in some humor. Traders used to say, the market is driven by fear and greed. Now it's driven by lines of code. Fear and greed have been outsourced to algorithms. If you want to picture modern finance, don't imagine Gordon Gekko in a flashy suit. Imagine a server room humming quietly, deciding your retirement fund's fate while you eat lunch. So what's the big picture? Computers and algorithms turned finance into a domain of math wizards. They brought incredible efficiency, uncovering profits and managing risks at speeds humans couldn't dream of. But they also made the system fragile, opaque, and sometimes terrifying. The wizards can conjure wealth, but they can also accidentally summon chaos. Finance is now a spellbook of algorithms, and we're all living with the magic, whether we like it or not. Let's wrap up. The 20th century began with the Great Depression, showing the failure of equations. It ended with the rise of computers, showing the power and danger of algorithms. Math had once again reinvented money, turning Wall Street into a battleground of codes and quants. And just when we thought the wizards had complete control, a new kind of math would arrive to shake things up even more: cryptography. Because if math could build money, maybe math could also become money. For thousands of years, money was about physical stuff: cows, coins, gold bars, paper promises. Then computers came along and started running the system with lightning-fast equations. But there was still one big problem: trust. How do you trust digital money when digital things can be copied, faked, or hacked? If you can copy a music file or a meme, what stops someone from copying dollars? Enter cryptography, the math of secrets. It didn't just protect money, it reinvented it. Let's start simple. Cryptography is about hiding information so only the right people can see it. Ancient kings used secret codes to send battle plans. Julius Caesar had his Caesar cipher, where he shifted letters by a fixed number. Cute, but crackable. Modern cryptography is way stronger, and in the digital age it became essential, because once money became numbers in computers, you needed airtight ways to make sure those numbers couldn't be forged. Without cryptography, your bank account would be about as secure as writing your PIN on a sticky note and posting it on Instagram. The foundation of modern cryptography is number theory, the study of prime numbers, factors, and modular arithmetic. Sounds boring, but it's basically the magic trick that makes the digital world work. Take RSA encryption, invented in the 1970s by Revest, Shamir, and Adelman. The idea is genius. Multiplying two huge prime numbers is easy, but factoring their product is insanely hard. Computers can check multiplication in seconds, but reversing it could take longer than the age of the universe. That one asymmetry is the lock and key of digital security. Here's a fun way to think about it. Imagine you mix two colors of paint, say red and blue, to get purple. Easy. But now someone asks you to look at the purple and tell them exactly how much red and how much blue went in. Nearly impossible. That's what factoring large numbers is like. And this paint trick keeps your bank account safe, your credit card transactions secure, and your embarrassing Google searches private. Math is literally standing guard over your secrets. Elliptic curve cryptography came later, offering even stronger security with smaller keys. The math behind it is beautiful and weird, curves looping on themselves, equations that feel like riddles, but the effect is simple. It makes digital transactions secure and efficient. Today, most of your online life is wrapped in elliptic curves, whether you know it or not. Cryptography turned the internet from a sketchy back alley into a somewhat safe marketplace. Without it, online banking, shopping, and streaming cat videos would all collapse into chaos. Now let's bring this back to money. Banks use cryptography to secure transactions. Every time you swipe a card or send money online, cryptographic protocols check identities, validate amounts, and prevent duplication. Your bank balance isn't protected by armed guards. It's protected by prime numbers and algorithms, which is both comforting and slightly terrifying. You don't see the math, but it's there, humming in the background, like an invisible security guard with a PhD. But cryptography didn't stop at protecting existing money. Eventually, people started asking, what if cryptography itself could be the money? What if math replaced not just the lock on the vault, but the vault, the coins, and the bank too? This question simmered for decades in the minds of computer scientists, mathematicians, and libertarians who really didn't like bankers. And eventually, it led to the invention of Bitcoin. But we'll save that drama for the next chapter. Before we get there, let's pause to appreciate how radical this shift was. For centuries, money required trust in some authority. A king, an empire, a bank, a government. Cryptography flipped the script. It said, you don't need kings or banks, you just need math. In cryptography, trust is decentralized. The code enforces the rules, not human promises. It's the cold, hard honesty of numbers. Here's a funny thought. Medieval peasants trusted coins because they were shiny and heavy. Modern citizens trust paper because it has fancy watermarks and the president's face. But we, in the digital age, are asked to trust equations, invisible math. Try explaining that to your grandma. Don't worry, grandma. Your money is safe because nobody can factor a 2048-bit number. Comforting, right? But cryptography isn't perfect. Just like Rome debased its coins, cryptographic systems can be weakened by bad design, sloppy coding, or sheer overconfidence. Hackers are like modern counterfeiters, poking at systems, looking for flaws, and looming in the background is quantum computing, which could one day crack current encryption like peanuts. The math arms race never ends. The only thing scarier than a hacker stealing your credit card is a quantum computer saying, "Oh, RSA, cute." Still, cryptography has done something extraordinary. It made digital trust possible. Without it, the internet wouldn't work. Online shopping wouldn't work. Banking apps wouldn't work. Honestly, your entire digital life would collapse into chaos. The cryptographic revolution wasn't flashy. It didn't come with gold coins or dramatic crashes, but it quietly transformed everything. And then when someone asked, can we just skip banks entirely and let math handle all of money? Cryptography was ready to say, hold my algorithm. So what's the big picture? Cryptography turned math into the gatekeeper of trust. It took prime numbers, elliptic curves, and clever algorithms and built the invisible infrastructure of modern money. It made your bank account secure, your transactions private, and your digital life possible. And it set the stage for the next big leap, Bitcoin, where money itself becomes cryptographic math. So here we are, after thousands of years of clay tokens, shiny coins, gold standards, and paper promises, we've arrived at one of the strangest inventions in financial history: Bitcoin, a form of money that doesn't exist physically, isn't issued by any king, government, or bank, and yet is valued in the hundreds of billions. To skeptics, it looks like a glorified math puzzle. To believers, it's the future of civilization. To most people, it's that thing your cousin won't stop talking about at family dinners. But underneath all the hype, Bitcoin is really just ancient math in modern clothes. Let's start with the basics. Bitcoin was invented in 2009 by someone or maybe a group using the name Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knows who Satoshi really is. They dropped a paper online, released some code, and then disappeared like a mathematical Batman. Their creation wasn't just digital money. It was a new system of trust, built entirely on math. No kings, no central banks, no gold vaults, just cryptography, computers, and a network of people agreeing to the rules. The genius of Bitcoin is the blockchain. At its core, a blockchain is just a giant ledger, a record of who owns what, shared across thousands of computers. Every time a transaction happens, it gets bundled into a block, stamped with cryptographic seals, and added to the chain. Once it's there, it can't be changed. It's like carving every transaction into digital stone tablets, except instead of temples and scribes, you've got nerds with graphics cards. If that sounds familiar, it should. Ancient Mesopotamians used clay tokens and tablets to track grain and sheep. Bitcoin is the same idea, except the clay is math and the sheep are digital. It's humanity's oldest financial trick, wrapped in 21 sensory algorithms. Satoshi basically said, remember those Mesopotamian ledgers? Let's put them on Wi-Fi. But how do you keep the ledger honest when nobody's in charge? That's where mining comes in. No, not pickaxes and hard hats. Bitcoin mining is math mining. Computers compete to solve extremely hard puzzles, basically guessing huge numbers until one fits. The winner adds a new block to the chain and gets rewarded with freshly minted bitcoins. This system, called proof of work, ensures the ledger is secure. To cheat it, you'd need more computing power than the rest of the network combined. Good luck with that. Even supervillains in comic books would give up. The beauty of this design is that trust doesn't come from rulers, banks, or middlemen. It comes from math. You don't need to trust anyone, you just trust the protocol. It's cold, decentralized, brutally honest. Either the math checks out, or the transaction doesn't happen. Bitcoin is money stripped of politics, borders, and central authority, at least in theory. Now, here's where the humor kicks in. In practice, Bitcoin has been, let's say, dramatic. Prices swing wildly. One day it's worth $60,000 a coin. The next it's crashing by half. It's been declared dead hundreds of times by newspapers, only to rise again like a mathematical zombie. People lose fortunes, make fortunes, and sometimes lose them again before lunch. Bitcoin is the only currency where you can accidentally buy 2 pizzas for what later turns out to be millions of dollars. True story. In 2010, a guy paid 10,000 bitcoins for 2 pizzas. At today's prices, that's the most expensive fast food order in history. Domino's should put up a statue of him. Skeptics say Bitcoin is a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, or just digital monopoly money. And they're not entirely wrong. Bitcoin doesn't have intrinsic value in the way gold does. You can't wear it, build with it, or bite it to test purity. Its value comes entirely from collective belief. But then again, so does all money. A dollar is just paper. Gold is shiny but useless for breakfast. Money has always been a story. Bitcoin just makes the story explicit. This coin is valuable because math says so, and enough people agree. And there's a deeper irony. Bitcoin was meant to escape banks, yet people now trade it on exchanges that look suspiciously like banks. It was meant to be anonymous, yet blockchain transactions are permanently recorded for all to see. It was meant to be free from speculation, yet speculation is its favorite sport. Bitcoin is part rebellion, part circus, part math experiment gone global. but love it or hate it, Bitcoin matters. It showed that you can create money out of pure cryptography. It proved that trust can come from decentralized math instead of centralized authority. And it inspired thousands of other cryptocurrencies, Ethereum, Dogecoin, and countless others with names that sound like inside jokes. Some are serious innovations. Others are digital lottery tickets, but they all trace back to Bitcoin's core idea: math can be money. And let's not forget the environmental debate. Bitcoin mining consumes massive amounts of electricity. Entire warehouses of computers hum day and night, solving pointless puzzles just to keep the ledger secure. Critics say it's wasteful. Defenders say it's worth it for decentralized freedom. It's the world's strangest trade-off. Burn gigawatts of power so strangers can trade internet coins without banks. Somewhere, Satoshi is either proud or face-palming. So what's the big picture? Bitcoin isn't magic. It's not even new. It's just the latest chapter in the ancient story of money. From clay tokens to gold coins to paper promises, humans have always used math to track value. Bitcoin takes that story and strips it down to its mathematical core: a ledger, cryptography, and trust in numbers. It's Mesopotamia, rebooted, ancient math in modern clothes. Let's wrap up. Bitcoin may or may not be the future. It may collapse tomorrow, or it may reshape global finance forever. But either way, it showed us something profound. Money has never been about the metal, the paper, or even the government behind it. It's always been about trust, written in math. And Bitcoin is math turned into money, with Wi-Fi. We've walked through thousands of years of money's history. Sheep, clay tokens, coins, gold, paper promises, credit, computers, algorithms, and Bitcoin. Each step wasn't just about stuff, but about math. And now we're left with a question: what's next? Will math itself become money? Will numbers replace not just the coins in our pockets, but the very idea of money altogether? Buckle up, because the future of money looks less like shiny coins and more like sci-fi math problems. First, let's talk about where we already are. Most of our money today isn't physical. It's numbers in databases. When you check your bank balance, you're not looking at stacks of bills in a vault. You're looking at digits in a spreadsheet. 90% of the world's money doesn't exist as cash. It's pure math. The transition has already happened. You don't carry money anymore. You carry trust in numbers glowing on a screen. But the next frontier might be programmable money. Cryptocurrencies like Ethereum are already experimenting with this. Instead of just sending coins, you can send contracts, little programs that execute automatically. Pay rent when the date hits. Send royalties when a song is streamed. No landlords chasing checks. No middlemen taking a cut. It's math running the economy directly. Imagine a future where money isn't just counted. It acts, it moves, it enforces rules. Your bank account might literally have code in it. Now here's where things get wild. Central banks are exploring digital currencies too, CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. Picture dollars, euros, or yen, but entirely digital and controlled by governments. Faster, trackable, programmable. That's both exciting and terrifying. On one hand, no more waiting 3 days for a transfer. On the other, every payment you make could, in theory, be monitored. Big Brother meets Big Math. The math works perfectly. The politics, maybe less so. And then there's AI. Artificial intelligence is already managing portfolios, approving loans, and spotting fraud. In the future, AI might be the bank. Imagine asking a chatbot for a mortgage and getting approved in seconds, with interest rates optimized for your entire life profile. Or imagine AI governments experimenting with universal basic income, sending everyone a steady stream of digital credits based on mathematical models of fairness. It sounds utopian or dystopian depending on whether you like robots controlling your wallet. Quantum computing could shake things up even more. Today's cryptography, the math that protects your money, relies on the difficulty of factoring huge numbers, but quantum computers could smash those problems easily. If that happens, the entire financial system would need new math overnight. A quantum future might bring quantum money, secured by equations so strange they'd make current cryptographers weep into their keyboards. Schrödinger's cat might not just be alive or dead, it might also be your accountant. But maybe the biggest shift won't be technical, it'll be philosophical. What if in the future we stop thinking of money as something separate from math and just see it as math itself? After all, money has always been about recording obligations, measuring value, balancing equations. Maybe one day, wealth won't be numbers in a bank, but access to computation, energy, processing power, algorithms. The real currency could be math resources. Forget dollars. Imagine people trading teraflops. Here's a fun scenario. Picture the year 2100. You walk into a cafe, not with cash, not with a credit card, not with Bitcoin. Instead, you rent a few microseconds of quantum processing power to pay for your coffee. The barista smiles, hands you your latte, and your money instantly reconfigures itself in a global network of math. No coins, no banks, no bills, just pure equations. It sounds absurd today, but so did paper money to a farmer in 1000 BCE. Wait, you're telling me you're paying for goats with paper? Madness. Yet here we are. Of course, money is more than math. It's culture, psychology, and power. Math can structure money, but humans will always add their quirks. We panic, we speculate, we hoard, we dream. No equation can fully capture human greed or hope. Even in a world of perfectly programmed money, people will find ways to bend the rules. That's not a bug, that's humanity. Still, the direction is clear. Math isn't just behind money anymore. It is money. From clay tokens to Bitcoin, we've been moving steadily toward abstraction, toward trust in numbers instead of objects. The future just pushes that trend to its logical extreme. Money becomes math, math becomes money, and the line between them disappears. And here's the humor in all this. We might end up right back where we started. The Mesopotamians used clay tablets to track grain. We're using blockchains to track coins. Different technology, same math. The only real difference is that now the tokens glow on screens instead of sitting in jars. Humanity keeps reinventing money, but the math behind it stays the same. Addition, subtraction, balance, trust. The tools evolve, the story repeats. So will math replace money? In some ways it already has. And in the future, it probably will even more. But the punchline is this. Money has always been math. It's always been equations disguised as coins, paper, or pixels. The future just strips away the disguise. In the end, maybe we'll laugh and realize we've been dreaming in compound interest all along. And if you've fallen asleep during this journey, congratulations, you're now dreaming in numbers. Don't worry, the math will still be here when you wake up. It always has been.